In the quietude of the ancient Stoa Poikile in Athens, the original Stoics gathered to discuss the art of living well. These philosophers weren't concerned with abstract theories that had no practical application. Their focus was singular: how to live in accordance with nature and reason to achieve eudaimonia, a state of flourishing, contentment, and virtue. Today, as we navigate the complexities of modern existence, their wisdom echoes through millennia with renewed relevance. Many of us move through life like travelers who have forgotten their destination. We rise each morning, perform our routines, meet our obligations, and rest each night without questioning whether the path we tread is truly our own. The ancient Stoics understood this peculiar human blindness, our tendency to sleepwalk through the most consequential decisions of our lives. They recognized that this unconscious drifting wasn't merely unfortunate, it was the greatest tragedy a human could experience. Consider the words of Seneca, writing to his friend Paulinus. "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. Life is long enough, and a sufficiently generous amount has been given to us for the highest achievements if it were all well invested. Yet how often do we truly invest our time with the careful deliberation it deserves? How frequently do we pause amid our endless activities to ask whether they align with our deepest values?" The modern world presents us with a paradox. We possess unprecedented freedom to chart our own course, yet simultaneously face powerful currents pushing us towards standardized definitions of success. Social media platforms bombard us with images of lives that seem worthy of emulation. Corporations craft narratives about what we should desire. Educational institutions channel us toward predetermined paths. Even our leisure activities often follow prescribed patterns rather than emerging organically from our true interests. Consider how often we hear stories of those who reach the summit of their careers only to find emptiness waiting for them. The executive who sacrificed family for advancement, now alone with their achievements. The person who pursued wealth at all costs, only to discover it bought everything except contentment. The individual who lived according to others' expectations, waking up decades later to the haunting question, "Whose life have I been living?" A 2021 survey found that 47% of Americans reported feeling like they were on autopilot in their daily lives. Another study revealed that among senior executives, nearly 60% admitted to having chosen their career path primarily based on external expectations rather than personal calling. The data consistently reveals a troubling pattern. A significant portion of humanity is living lives they never consciously chose. The tragedy isn't simply that these realizations come, it's that they arrive so late. By the time many people recognize their misalignment, decades have passed. Health has often declined. Relationships have suffered irreparable damage. Opportunities have vanished. The window for profound change has narrowed considerably. This delayed awareness constitutes what philosophers call tragic knowledge, insights that arrive too late to be fully acted upon. As Epictetus observed, make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. But how can we make the best use of our power if we only recognize our true desires and values in life's final chapters? The ancient Stoics anticipated these modern dilemmas with remarkable foresight. They understood that humans in every era would struggle with the same fundamental challenge, distinguishing between authentic desires and those implanted by society. They recognized our tendency to confuse conventional measures of success with genuine flourishing. Epictetus, once a slave who became one of Stoicism's greatest teachers, offered this wisdom. Better to trip with the feet than with the tongue, but better still to trip with neither. Physical stumbles may cause momentary pain, but stumbling through life's greater choices, remaining in the wrong career, relationship, or mindset, extracts a far heavier toll. These aren't mere missteps, they're misalignments that compound over time, silently draining our potential for flourishing. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, writing private meditations to himself amid the crushing responsibilities of ruling an empire, repeatedly returned to this theme. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, "I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain of if I'm going to do what I was born for?" This question, "What were you born for?" lies at the heart of the Stoic enterprise. The Stoics would argue that we were born to live virtuously, in accordance with nature and reason. Yet modern life seems designed to distract us from this simple truth. We're surrounded by unprecedented options, yet paradoxically guided by powerful currents of social expectation. We scroll through carefully curated glimpses of others' lives, unconsciously absorbing narratives about what success should look like. The metrics become external: salary, status, possessions, while our internal compass grows neglected and unreliable. This misalignment manifests in subtle ways before it becomes unmistakable. Like a ship that's just a few degrees off course at the beginning of its journey, the deviation seems insignificant until we find ourselves arriving at an entirely different destination than we intended. The discontent we attribute to temporary circumstances gradually reveals itself as something deeper, evidence that our lives have drifted from our truest values. Consider the Roman statesman Cicero, who wrote, "Not for ourselves alone are we born. Our country, our friends, have a share in us." Yet how many today pursue purely individualistic success, accumulating wealth and status, while their communities crumble and relationships wither? The Stoics would view this as a profound misunderstanding of human nature. We are, by nature, social animals meant to live in harmony with others. A life that ignores this truth cannot help but feel hollow, no matter its external trappings of success. The signs of misalignment often begin as whispers that we dismiss or rationalize away. The Sunday evening dread as another work week approaches. The vague sense of emptiness after achieving a long-sought goal. The recurring fantasy of a completely different life. The need for increasingly potent distractions to numb an underlying dissatisfaction. These are not random neuroses, but meaningful data, evidence that our lives have drifted from their proper course. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, began his philosophical journey after surviving a shipwreck. Having lost his material wealth, he wandered into a bookshop in Athens and discovered the teachings of Socrates. This catastrophic loss became the catalyst for his true calling. Not everyone receives such dramatic wake-up calls, but the Stoics would argue that life constantly provides us with smaller signals if we're willing to pay attention. Stoicism provides not just diagnosis, but remedy. Unlike many philosophical schools that remained theoretical, Stoicism was designed as practical medicine for the soul. Its teachings offer a framework for recognizing misalignment early, before the cost becomes too great. The Stoics developed exercises and perspectives precisely to help us course-correct while time remains abundant. One such practice was the contemplation of death, not as a morbid obsession, but as a clarifying lens. Seneca advised, "Let us prepare our minds as if we'd come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day." This memento mori tradition wasn't meant to induce anxiety, but to cut through the trivial concerns that often dominate our attention and reveal what truly matters. Another Stoic practice involved regular self-examination. Epictetus recommended, "Make it your practice to say to every harsh appearance, 'You are just an appearance, and not at all what you appear to be.'" This questioning helps us distinguish between authentic values and societal programming. Is the promotion we're pursuing actually aligned with our conception of a good life? Or have we simply internalized others' definitions of success? The ancients understood something we often forget, that living authentically isn't a luxury, but a necessity for human flourishing. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, yet humble student of wisdom, wrote to himself, "At every moment, keep a sturdy mind on the task at hand, as becomes a Roman and a human being, doing it with strict and simple dignity, affection, freedom, and justice." In his private journal, the most powerful man in the world reminded himself that power meant nothing if his life was not aligned with his deepest principles. What makes the Stoic perspective so valuable is its emphasis on personal responsibility. While acknowledging the external pressures that shape our choices, Stoicism refuses to grant them deterministic power. Epictetus famously distinguished between what is up to us and what is not. Our opinions, desires, aversions, and choices fall within our control. Everything else does not. This distinction empowers us to recognize that while we may have been unconsciously influenced in choosing our current path, the choice to continue or change direction remains firmly ours. The modern obsession with authenticity often lacks philosophical grounding. We speak of finding ourselves without clear methods for doing so. Stoicism fills this gap with practical wisdom. It suggests that self-knowledge emerges not from endless introspection, but from observing our responses to life's challenges. Our true values reveal themselves in our actions, not our declarations. Consider how we respond to setbacks, inconveniences, and losses. Do minor frustrations derail our entire day? Do we become envious when peers succeed? Do we avoid difficult conversations? These reactions reveal our underlying beliefs about what constitutes a good life far more accurately than our stated principles. The Stoics believed that recognizing these signs wasn't cause for despair, but for hope. Unlike those who realize too late that they've spent decades on the wrong path, seeing these warnings now gives you something precious: the opportunity to change course while the journey still stretches before you. As Seneca wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." Think of the people you admire most. Are they those who accumulated the most wealth, achieved the highest status, or gained the most fame? Or are they those who lived with integrity, treated others with kindness, and maintained equanimity amid life's challenges? Stoicism suggests that the latter qualities constitute the true measure of a life well lived. Our modern obsession with optimization often focuses on efficiency, productivity, and achievement. But the Stoics would ask a more fundamental question: what good is efficiently walking in the wrong direction? What value is there in optimizing a life that isn't truly yours? Psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl, whose work bears remarkable similarities to Stoic philosophy, observed that many of his patients suffered not from clinical disorders, but from what he called an existential vacuum, a lack of meaning in their lives. This vacuum, he argued, couldn't be filled by pleasure, power, or success, but only by finding purposes worthy of our unique capabilities. The Stoics would concur. They viewed humans as naturally purpose-driven creatures who could only find fulfillment by aligning their actions with virtuous ends. Seneca noted, "If one doesn't know to which port one is sailing, no wind is favorable." The signs of misalignment we'll explore aren't simply indications that something is wrong. They're invitations to rediscover the port toward which we should be sailing. But before we can correct our course, we must first acknowledge that we've drifted. This requires a rare and precious quality: the courage to look unflinchingly at our lives as they are, not as we pretend them to be. It demands that we question assumptions that may have guided us for decades. It asks us to risk discomfort and uncertainty in service of a greater authenticity. As we prepare to examine the 5 signs that you may be living the wrong life, approach them not with fear, but with curiosity. These indicators aren't judgments of your worth, but opportunities for greater self-awareness. The goal isn't to induce crisis, but to invite reflection, to create space for the questions that matter most, before life poses them to us in ways we cannot ignore. Remember the words of Epictetus: "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." The journey toward a life aligned with your true values begins with this simple but profound recognition: the power to change course remains yours, regardless of how long you've been adrift. What follows are 5 unmistakable signs that your life may have drifted from its proper course. 5 warnings that Stoic wisdom can help us recognize before regret becomes our constant companion. These aren't merely philosophical observations, but practical indicators, visible in our daily experience if we have the courage to look for them. Each sign points to a specific misalignment between how we're living and what truly constitutes a life well lived according to Stoic wisdom. More importantly, each offers a path back to congruence, a way to realign our choices with our nature as rational social beings capable of virtue and excellence. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with recognizing that we may have been walking in the wrong direction. Let us now turn our attention to these 5 critical signs with open minds and willing hearts, ready to hear what the ancient Stoics still have to teach us about living lives worthy of the brief time we're granted. There exists a peculiar form of suffering unique to our time, one that doesn't announce itself with physical pain, but manifests as a persistent, low-grade discomfort that colors our experience of daily life. The ancient Stoics, with their remarkable psychological insight, anticipated this condition. They didn't have a single term for it, but their writings are filled with descriptions of people living at odds with their true nature, experiencing what we might now call existential dissatisfaction. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them, wrote Epictetus. This simple observation contains profound implications. If our disturbance stems not from external circumstances, but from our interpretation of them, then much of our suffering might originate not in life's hardships, but in misaligned perspectives, in seeing our circumstances through lenses that distort rather than clarify. Consider the bizarre contradiction of contemporary affluence. We inhabit the most materially comfortable period in human history. Technologies that would have seemed miraculous to previous generations are commonplace. Information that once required years to access now appears instantly at our command. Medical advances have extended both lifespan and health span. Yet studies consistently show that rates of anxiety, depression, and loneliness continue to rise across developed nations. This paradox wouldn't have surprised the Stoics. Their philosophy recognized that material comfort, while preferable to hardship, could never provide the deeper satisfaction that humans inherently seek. As Seneca noted, it is not the man who has too little who is poor, but the one who hankers after more. The ancient philosophers understood that abundance could create its own form of poverty, a poverty of meaning, purpose, and authentic engagement. The Stoics developed their philosophy during a period of extraordinary political and social upheaval. The stable structures of the Roman Republic were crumbling, giving way to imperial rule. Traditional values were being challenged by exposure to diverse cultures throughout the expanding empire. Economic inequality was growing alongside unprecedented wealth. In many ways, they faced disorientation similar to what we experience in our rapidly changing world. Their response wasn't to retreat into nostalgia for simpler times or to embrace the prevailing currents uncritically. Instead, they sought to develop an inner compass that could guide individuals through uncertainty, a set of principles that remained valid regardless of external circumstances. This approach makes their wisdom particularly relevant as we navigate our own era of accelerating change and dissolving certainties. At the heart of Stoic psychology lies a crucial distinction: the difference between what is within our control and what is not. Some things are within our power, while others are not, Epictetus taught. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, office, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. This distinction might seem obvious, yet the Stoics observed that most human suffering stems from confusing these categories, from treating external circumstances as if they were within our control while neglecting the internal domain where our true power lies. This confusion doesn't just cause occasional distress, it creates a fundamental misalignment between our nature and our approach to life. The modern parallels are striking. We obsess over stock markets we cannot control while neglecting our responses to financial fluctuations, which we can control. We fixate on others' opinions, which lie beyond our influence, while paying little attention to the values by which we judge ourselves. We pursue status and recognition, inherently unstable externals, while neglecting the internal qualities that make recognition meaningful. This misalignment manifests in what philosopher Henry David Thoreau famously described as lives of quiet desperation, not acute suffering, but a chronic sense that something essential is missing, that beneath our busy schedules and material comforts lies a void we cannot name but constantly feel. The Stoics would recognize this condition immediately. Marcus Aurelius, writing private meditations never intended for publication, repeatedly reminded himself to look beyond surface appearances to the true nature of his circumstances. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment. This wasn't an invitation to denial or toxic positivity. The Stoics weren't suggesting we ignore difficulties or pretend that painful circumstances are pleasant. Rather, they were pointing to our power to assign meaning to events, to interpret our experiences in ways that either align with our deepest values or contradict them. Consider how differently two people might experience the same external circumstance. One person views a job loss as a catastrophic failure that defines their worth. Another sees it as a challenging but temporary setback that creates space for reassessment and growth. The external event is identical. The interpretations, and thus the experiences, are radically different. Musonius Rufus, a Stoic often overshadowed by his more famous counterparts, observed that it is not possible to live well today unless you treat it as your last day. This perspective doesn't induce anxiety, but clarity. It cuts through trivialities and reveals what truly matters when our time is understood as finite and precious. Yet how many of us live with this clarity? How many treat ordinary moments with the reverence they would deserve if we knew they were our last? The gap between this ideal and our typical experience represents a profound misalignment, one that creates a persistent sense of having missed something essential, even when we cannot identify what we've missed. Modern neuroscience offers intriguing parallels to Stoic insights. Researchers have identified what they call the default mode network, a set of brain regions that activate when we're not focused on external tasks. This network appears responsible for self-referential thinking, including rumination about the past and anxiety about the future. Interestingly, practices that interrupt this default mode, meditation, flow states, and present moment awareness, consistently correlate with increased well-being. The Stoics developed their own interventions to address this tendency toward harmful rumination. One was the practice of premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. Rather than anxiously avoiding thoughts of potential difficulties, they deliberately imagined challenging scenarios, reducing their emotional impact and developing response strategies in advance. This practice didn't induce anxiety, but alleviated it, transforming vague dread into specific preparation. Another powerful Stoic practice involved the contemplation of impermanence. By regularly reflecting on the transient nature of possessions, relationships, and life itself, they cultivated an appreciation that transformed ordinary experiences. Pass through this brief patch of time in harmony with nature, Marcus Aurelius advised himself, and come to your final resting place gracefully, just as a ripened olive might drop, praising the earth that nourished it and grateful to the tree that gave it growth. This perspective doesn't diminish life's pleasures, but enhances them. When we recognize that nothing lasts, not health, not relationships, not achievements, each moment gains poignancy and significance. Ordinary pleasures become extraordinary when viewed through the lens of their impermanence. Yet our culture tends to avoid this truth, creating elaborate distractions from our mortality and finitude. We chase endless growth, accumulation, and achievement as if they represented permanent solutions to temporary existence. This denial creates another form of misalignment between our mortal nature and our immortal aspirations. The psychologist Ernest Becker, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning work, The Denial of Death, argued that much of human culture serves as an elaborate defense mechanism against our awareness of mortality. We pursue what he called immortality projects, attempts to transcend our finite nature through achievement, offspring, or ideology. Yet these projects ultimately fail to address the underlying reality they're designed to obscure. The Stoics would suggest a different approach, not denial, but integration. Rather than fleeing from awareness of our mortality, they recommended embracing it as the context that gives life meaning. Let us prepare our minds as if we'd come to the very end of life, Seneca advised. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. This isn't morbid, but liberating. When we acknowledge the finite nature of our time, priorities clarify themselves. Petty grievances lose their power. Procrastination becomes obviously self-defeating. The present moment gains the significance it always deserved, but rarely received. The philosopher William James observed that the greatest discovery of my generation is that a human being can alter his life by altering his attitudes of mind. The Stoics understood this principle millennia earlier. They recognized that while we cannot control external events, we maintain absolute sovereignty over our interpretations, over the meaning we assign to our experiences. This sovereignty represents both freedom and responsibility. We are free to interpret our circumstances in ways that align with our deepest values, but we're also responsible for the interpretations we choose and the consequences they create. This choice, moment by moment, determines whether we experience life as aligned with our nature or at odds with it. Consider the concept of preferred indifference in Stoic philosophy. They recognized that certain externals, health, wealth, reputation, were naturally preferred to their opposites. It's generally better to be healthy than sick, prosperous than impoverished, respected than reviled. Yet they insisted that these preferences should remain subordinate to virtue, to living in accordance with nature and reason. This hierarchy allows for a balanced approach to life's circumstances. We can work toward preferred outcomes without attaching our well-being to their achievement. We can recognize that while external advantages make life easier, they don't make it better in the essential sense that truly matters. Modern research on happiness supports this ancient wisdom. Studies consistently show that beyond meeting basic needs, increased wealth correlates only weakly with increased happiness. Relationships, meaning, and purposeful activity prove far stronger predictors of well-being than material circumstances alone. Yet our culture continues to promote the opposite message, that happiness depends primarily on external achievements and acquisitions. This contradiction creates another misalignment between our nature and our pursuits. We chase conditions that research suggests won't satisfy us, while neglecting the internal states and connections that would. The philosopher Alain de Botton notes that we are not only in the universe is also in us. This poetic observation points to another form of misalignment between our interconnected nature and our individualistic culture. The Stoics, despite their reputation for self-sufficiency, recognized that humans are inherently social beings whose well-being depends on their relationship with the larger whole. We are made for cooperation, Marcus Aurelius wrote, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, like the rows of the upper and lower teeth. To act against one another then is contrary to nature. This recognition of our interdependence stands in stark contrast to the atomized individualism that characterizes much of modern life. Yet many today live in profound isolation despite unprecedented connectivity. We maintain hundreds of digital connections while experiencing record levels of loneliness. We participate in communities based on consumption rather than shared purpose. We measure success by individual achievement rather than collective flourishing. This separation creates another form of misalignment between our social nature and our isolated existence. The Stoics would view this not as a personal failure, but as a structural challenge requiring conscious intervention. They developed practices to counter this tendency, including regular engagement in civic life and the cultivation of friendship based on virtue rather than utility or pleasure. The contemporary relevance of these insights becomes clearer when we examine modern research on social connection. Studies consistently show that meaningful relationships represent one of the strongest predictors of both physical health and subjective well-being. Isolation, by contrast, correlates with increased mortality at rates comparable to smoking or obesity. Yet our economic and technological systems often undermine these connections rather than strengthening them. Remote work reduces casual interaction. Social media replaces depth with breadth. Economic pressures require mobility that separates extended families. These forces don't determine our fate, but they create headwinds against the connection our nature requires. The Stoics would advise neither passive acceptance nor futile resistance to these conditions. Instead, they would recommend conscious adaptation, developing practices that honor our social nature despite environmental challenges. This might involve prioritizing depth over breadth in relationships, creating intentional communities around shared values, or using technology to enhance rather than replace in-person connection. Another form of misalignment emerges from our relationship with the natural world. The Stoics viewed nature not as a resource to be exploited, but as a system of which humans form an integral part. Living according to nature meant aligning our actions with the larger patterns and processes of the cosmos. Yet modern life often positions us in opposition to these natural rhythms. We maintain artificial light that disrupts circadian cycles. We consume foods available only through global supply chains rather than seasonal patterns. We isolate ourselves in climate-controlled environments that shield us from the elements our bodies evolved to experience. These conveniences offer obvious benefits, but they also create subtle costs, disconnection from the natural systems that shaped our evolution and continue to influence our well-being. Research increasingly confirms that exposure to natural environments reduces stress, improves cognitive function, and enhances mood. The Japanese practice of Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, has been shown to lower cortisol levels and blood pressure while improving immune function. The Stoics would likely view our environmental crisis not merely as a technical challenge, but as a symptom of philosophical misalignment, a failure to recognize our place within rather than above the natural world. They would invite us to reconsider our relationship with nature, not from guilt or obligation, but from a recognition of our interconnection with all existence. As we navigate these various forms of misalignment between our values and our actions, our mortality and our denial, our social nature and our isolation, our natural being and our artificial environments, the Stoic perspective offers not rigid prescriptions, but flexible principles adaptable to individual circumstances. The path toward greater alignment doesn't require dramatic upheaval or perfect consistency. It begins with awareness, with noticing the gaps between our professed values and our lived experience. It continues through incremental adjustments that gradually bring our external circumstances into harmony with our internal compass. The ultimate goal isn't perfection, but progress, not the elimination of all tension, but the cultivation of greater coherence between who we are and how we live. This coherence doesn't guarantee happiness in the conventional sense, but offers something perhaps more valuable: integrity, authenticity, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living in accordance with our nature. As we continue our exploration of the misaligned life, remember that the Stoics didn't view philosophy as an academic exercise, but as practical medicine for the soul. Their insights weren't meant to be merely understood, but embodied, translated from intellectual concepts into lived experience. The value of their wisdom lies not in its elegance, but in its application to the concrete challenges we face each day. The path they illuminate doesn't promise ease but meaning, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of purpose that makes difficulty worthwhile. In a world that often measures success by external metrics, they remind us that the true measure of a life well lived lies in its alignment with nature, reason, and virtue, qualities available to all regardless of circumstance. The journey toward this alignment begins with a simple but profound question: am I living as I was meant to live? The answer may not come immediately or completely, but the question itself represents the first step toward a life no longer defined by quiet desperation, but by conscious choice and authentic expression. Throughout human history, there have been those rare individuals who managed to wake from the collective trance, who recognized their misalignment while time remained to change course. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, despite wielding power unimaginable to most, wrote private reflections revealing his struggle to remain true to his values amid corrupting influences. Seneca, advisor to emperors and one of Rome's wealthiest men, continuously examined whether his circumstances were enhancing or diminishing his character. Epictetus, having experienced both slavery and freedom, understood the difference between external circumstance and internal liberty better than most. These philosophers didn't merely theorize about alignment. They lived their questions, experimenting with practical techniques to maintain clarity amid life's complexities. They developed what might be called an early warning system for detecting misalignment before it progresses from subtle dissatisfaction to irreversible regret. The chief task in life is simply this, wrote Epictetus, to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control. This seemingly simple task proves extraordinarily difficult in practice. Our minds continuously blur these categories, attributing our distress to external events rather than our judgments about them, seeking control where none exists while neglecting the domain of true autonomy. This confusion creates a peculiar form of suffering unique to human beings. the ability to remain miserable amid favorable circumstances or find tranquility amid hardship. The Stoics recognized that this capacity stems from our relationship with our own thoughts, from the stories we tell ourselves about what is happening and what it means. Modern cognitive psychology echoes this ancient wisdom with remarkable fidelity. Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, observed that people's emotions and behaviors are influenced by their perception of events. It is not a situation in itself that determines what people feel, but rather the way in which they construe a situation. This insight forms the foundation of therapeutic approaches that have helped millions address psychological distress by examining and revising their interpretive frameworks. The Stoics anticipated these therapeutic techniques by millennia. They developed practices for identifying, questioning, and revising harmful judgments before they crystallize into emotional disturbance. Between stimulus and response, there is a space, wrote Viktor Frankl, capturing a fundamental Stoic insight. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Yet modern life seems designed to collapse this space, to eliminate the gap between stimulus and response through constant distraction, immediate gratification, and algorithmic manipulation. We're encouraged to react rather than reflect, to consume rather than contemplate, to express rather than examine. These pressures don't determine our fate, but they create powerful currents against which we must consciously swim if we wish to maintain autonomy. The consequences of surrendering this autonomy extend far beyond momentary distress. They accumulate as lives led according to external scripts rather than internal values, as regrets that become apparent only when options for change have narrowed significantly. A palliative care nurse named Bronnie Ware, who worked with patients in the final weeks of their lives, documented their most common regrets. Among the top 5 were, "I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me, and I wish I hadn't worked so hard." These aren't regrets about external circumstances, but about misalignment, about having followed paths that, while socially approved and materially rewarded, diverged from authentic values and priorities. The tragedy isn't merely that these realizations come, but that they arrive too late for meaningful correction. The Stoics understood that wisdom consists not in avoiding all error, but in recognizing misalignment early enough to adjust course while significant life remains ahead. Many men, Seneca observed, when they are getting ready to build a house, do not count the expense of upkeep. That is the way with many desires. They do not count the cost at the beginning. This cost extends beyond financial resources to life's truly finite currency, our time, attention, and vitality. We commit to paths without calculating their true expense in terms of what matters most. Modern research on happiness and well-being provides empirical support for Stoic insights. Studies consistently show that after basic needs are met, additional wealth correlates only weakly with increased happiness. Relationships, meaning, and purposeful activity prove far stronger predictors of well-being than material circumstances alone. Yet our educational and economic systems continue to promote the opposite message, that success depends primarily on external achievements and acquisitions. This contradiction creates another misalignment between our nature and our pursuits. We chase conditions that research suggests won't satisfy us while neglecting the internal states and connections that would. This collective misdirection isn't accidental, but systemic. Consumer capitalism requires that we remain perpetually unsatisfied, continuously seeking fulfillment through acquisition rather than alignment. Advertising doesn't merely promote products, but cultivates discontentment with our current circumstances, a chronic sense that we lack what we need to be complete. The Stoics would view these forces not as conspiracies, but as predictable expressions of human nature operating at scale. They wouldn't advocate withdrawal from society, but greater awareness of its influence, a conscious evaluation of cultural messages against the standard of our authentic values. If you want to improve, Epictetus advised, be content to be thought foolish and stupid with regard to external things. This willingness to diverge from conventional wisdom represents perhaps the greatest challenge to alignment in an age of unprecedented social pressure and surveillance. Standing apart requires not just clarity about one's values, but courage to honor them despite social costs. Yet this courage becomes more accessible when we recognize the alternative: the quiet desperation of a life lived according to external metrics rather than internal truth. As Henry David Thoreau observed, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. This desperation stems not from material lack, but from spiritual poverty, from the gap between our authentic nature and our daily existence. The path toward greater alignment doesn't require dramatic upheaval or perfect consistency. It begins with awareness, with noticing the gaps between our professed values and our lived experience. It continues through incremental adjustments that gradually bring our external circumstances into harmony with our internal compass. The ultimate goal isn't perfection, but progress. Not the elimination of all tension, but the cultivation of greater coherence between who we are and how we live. This coherence doesn't guarantee happiness in the conventional sense, but offers something perhaps more valuable: integrity, authenticity, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living in accordance with our nature. The journey ahead involves examining 5 critical signs that your life may have drifted from its proper course. These aren't merely philosophical observations, but practical indicators, visible in our daily experience if we have the courage to look for them. Each points to a specific misalignment between how we're living and what truly constitutes a life well lived according to Stoic wisdom. As we prepare to explore these signs, approach them not with fear, but with curiosity. They aren't judgments of your worth, but opportunities for greater self-awareness. The goal isn't to induce crisis, but to invite reflection, to create space for the questions that matter most before life poses them to us in ways we cannot ignore. Remember the words of Epictetus: "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." The journey toward a life aligned with your true values begins with this simple but profound recognition: the power to change course remains yours, regardless of how long you've been adrift. What follows are 5 unmistakable signs that your life may have drifted from its proper course. 5 warnings that Stoic wisdom can help us recognize before regret becomes our constant companion. These aren't merely philosophical observations, but practical indicators, visible in daily experience if we have the courage to examine our lives honestly. Each sign points to a specific misalignment between our actions and our nature as rational, social beings capable of virtue and excellence. More importantly, each offers a path back to congruence, a way to realign our choices with our authentic values before it's too late to change course. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with recognizing that we may have been walking in the wrong direction. Let us now explore these 5 critical signs with open minds and willing hearts, ready to hear what the ancient Stoics still have to teach us about living lives worthy of the brief time we're granted. Sign 1: you spend more time complaining than acting. The irony of our modern condition is that we've never had so many platforms to voice our frustrations, yet we've never felt more stuck. Social media has become our collective complaint box, a digital wall where we scrawl our grievances, hoping someone might notice, validate, or perhaps fix them for us. But the Stoics knew something we've forgotten. Complaining is a misallocation of our most precious resource, our attention. Consider how much mental energy you've spent in the past week dwelling on things beyond your control. The coworker who never replies to emails promptly, the weather that ruined your weekend plans, the political situation that fills you with dread, the traffic that made you late, the rising costs of everything, the family member who just won't change. In these moments of frustration, we often reach for the easiest tool in our emotional arsenal: complaint. What makes complaint so seductive is its immediate relief. There's a momentary satisfaction in articulating our displeasure, in finding the perfect words to capture exactly how we've been wronged. We feel seen when others acknowledge our complaints, vindicated when they share our outrage. For a fleeting moment, the act of complaining makes us feel less powerless against the injustices of our daily lives. But this satisfaction is an illusion, a false promise that keeps us trapped in cycles of inaction and dissatisfaction. The Stoics recognized this pattern thousands of years before our modern psychology gave it a name. They understood that complaint is not merely unproductive, it's actively harmful to our well-being and our capacity for meaningful action. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome and perhaps history's most powerful Stoic, wrote in his personal journal, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." These weren't empty words from a privileged ruler. They were reminders he desperately needed while facing plagues, rebellions, betrayals, and the crushing weight of imperial responsibility. Imagine the burdens carried by a Roman emperor, responsible for the welfare of millions across 3 continents, constantly managing threats both internal and external, making decisions that would affect generations to come. Marcus could have easily spent his days complaining about disloyal generals, scheming politicians, or the relentless demands of his position. Instead, he turned inward, focusing on the one domain where his control was absolute, his own judgments and reactions. The distinction he draws is at the heart of Stoic philosophy, the dichotomy of control. Some things are within our power and some things are not. When we complain, we're essentially rejecting this fundamental truth of existence. We're railing against reality itself, demanding that the world conform to our expectations rather than adapting ourselves to what is. This misalignment creates a particular kind of suffering that the Stoics were keen to address. They saw that humans are uniquely capable of adding a second layer of pain to their experiences. There is the initial discomfort of an unwelcome situation, and then there is the additional suffering we create through our resistance to it. Complaint is one form this resistance takes, a verbal insistence that things should be different than they are. What happens when you spend an hour venting about your boss's unreasonable expectations? The expectations remain unchanged. What happens when you complain about being overlooked for a promotion? The decision stands. What happens when you rage against the political climate? The policies continue unaltered. In each case, the only tangible result is a depletion of your own mental resources that could have been directed toward productive action. The Stoics would view our modern habit of complaining as a peculiar form of self-torture, voluntarily giving away our peace of mind to situations we cannot change. It's like repeatedly touching a hot stove and being surprised that it burns. Or, as Epictetus more eloquently put it, it is not events that disturb people, it is their judgments concerning them. There's a subtle addiction to complaining that we rarely acknowledge. The brief catharsis of venting provides the illusion of having done something about our problems. We mistake expression for action. We confuse articulating our frustrations with addressing them. Each time we indulge in complaint, we reinforce neural pathways that make this our default response to discomfort. A friend once told me about his experiment with a complaint jar. For 1 month, he put $1 in a jar every time he caught himself complaining. By the end of the month, he had enough money for a nice dinner, but more importantly, he had become aware of just how automatic his complaining had become. "I realized I was complaining about things I had completely forgotten an hour later," he said, "things that weren't worth the energy I was giving them." This is the insidious nature of complaint. It drains us of the very energy we need to create meaningful change. While we're busy describing the shape of our problems in vivid detail, we could be taking small steps toward their solution. This misallocation of energy is particularly tragic because human attention is finite. Every moment spent in complaint is a moment not spent in action. The habit of complaint also blinds us to our own agency. When we focus exclusively on external factors, the incompetence of others, the unfairness of systems, the misalignment of circumstances with our desires, we position ourselves as helpless victims of forces beyond our control. This narrative, while temporarily comforting, "It's not my fault," is ultimately disempowering. It places the locus of control entirely outside ourselves, leaving us perpetually waiting for the world to change instead of changing our approach to it. The Stoics would argue that this habit of complaint is not merely unproductive, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of our role in life. We are not passive observers meant to comment on what happens to us. We are agents capable of responding to circumstances with dignity and purpose. Epictetus, once a slave before becoming a renowned Stoic teacher, put it bluntly, "Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens." Having experienced true powerlessness, he understood that freedom begins with accepting what we cannot change and focusing intently on what we can. This acceptance is not resignation or defeat. It's not about lowering your standards or abandoning your values. Rather, it's about recognizing the boundaries of your influence and channeling your energy accordingly. It's about understanding that complaining about the rain won't keep you dry, but building a shelter will. Perhaps most importantly, the Stoic critique of complaint isn't about suppressing emotions or maintaining a facade of constant positivity. The Stoics weren't advocating for emotional repression. They were suggesting emotional redirection. Feel the frustration, acknowledge the disappointment, but then ask, what aspect of this situation can I influence, however slightly? What small action can I take today? This shift from complaint to action represents one of the most profound transformations we can make in our lives, a transformation that begins with recognizing the warning signs of our own complaining habits. Perhaps you've found yourself repeating the same grievances to different people, hoping for a different response. Or maybe you've noticed how conversations with certain friends inevitably devolve into mutual complaint sessions, leaving you both feeling validated but unchanged. These patterns indicate that complaint has become your default response to difficulty rather than a stepping stone toward solution. The psychological toll of this habit extends far beyond the moments spent in complaint. When we repeatedly articulate our problems without addressing them, we strengthen neural pathways associated with helplessness and victimhood. Research in neuroscience suggests that our brains develop according to what we practice. Complain regularly, and you become more adept at seeing problems. Take action regularly, and you become more skilled at creating solutions. Seneca, another prominent Stoic philosopher and advisor to Emperor Nero, observed this pattern in his contemporaries. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. He recognized that many of our complaints are about anticipated problems rather than actual ones. The dreaded meeting that might go poorly, the confrontation that could turn unpleasant, the project that might fail. In these cases, complaint becomes a form of negative visualization that primes us for defeat before we've even begun. This stands in stark contrast to the Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, which involves visualizing potential challenges not to complain about them, but to prepare constructive responses. Where chronic complainers imagine difficulties and stop there, Stoics imagine difficulties and then mentally rehearse how they will respond with virtue and practical wisdom. Consider how differently two people might approach the same challenging situation, say a project deadline being moved up unexpectedly. The habitual complainer might spend hours lamenting the unfairness of the new timeline, cataloging all the reasons it's unreasonable, and speculating about the ulterior motives of those who made the decision. The Stoic practitioner, while acknowledging the difficulty, would quickly move to the questions that matter. What aspects of this project can be simplified? Which resources can be reallocated? What expectations need to be reset? How can I adapt my approach to meet this new reality? Both individuals feel the initial frustration, but they direct that emotional energy in fundamentally different ways. The complainer disperses it through words that change nothing. The Stoic channels it into thoughts and actions that might improve the situation, however marginally. This distinction becomes even more significant when we consider collective complaints, the shared grievances of families, communities, and cultures. When groups unite around what they oppose, rather than what they can create, they often find themselves trapped in cycles of blame and inaction. Political discourse frequently falls into this pattern, with opposing factions more interested in articulating the failures of their adversaries than in proposing viable solutions. The Stoics would view this tendency with particular concern, as they placed high value on our responsibilities as social creatures. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself, "We were born to work together like feet, hands, and eyes, like the two rows of teeth, upper and lower." Chronic complaint undermines this cooperation, creating division where cohesion is needed. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of a complaint-centered life is how it gradually narrows our perspective. When we habitually focus on what's wrong, we develop a kind of selective attention that filters out evidence of what's right or possible. The world becomes increasingly defined by its flaws rather than its opportunities. As our complaints accumulate, our capacity for appreciation diminishes. This narrowing has profound implications for our happiness. Modern positive psychology, in many ways the scientific heir to Stoic wisdom, has demonstrated that our well-being depends less on our circumstances than on what we choose to notice and how we choose to respond. Gratitude practices, deliberately attending to what is going well, consistently show stronger correlations with life satisfaction than improvements in objective circumstances. The Stoics understood this relationship between attention and well-being. Epictetus advised his students, "He is a wise man who does not grieve for the things which he has not, but rejoices for those which he has." This isn't mere positive thinking, it's a radical reclamation of where we direct our mental energy. Every complaint represents attention diverted from what we could be appreciating or improving. There's also the matter of how complaint affects our relationships. Few behaviors repel others more consistently than chronic negativity. We may find temporary allies in shared complaint, but these connections lack the depth and resilience of relationships built on shared purpose and mutual growth. As Marcus Aurelius noted, "When you arise in the morning, think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love." Those who spend their energy on complaint often miss these privileges entirely, focusing instead on what they believe they're entitled to but haven't received. This sense of entitlement, the belief that life should be easier, people should be different, systems should work better, fuels much of our complaining behavior. The Stoics would find this particularly puzzling, as they held no expectation that life should be easy or that fortune should always favor them. Epictetus, who lived much of his life as a slave before gaining his freedom, was especially clear on this point. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Having experienced genuine oppression, he understood the difference between legitimate grievance and habitual complaint. The former acknowledges injustice as a step toward addressing it. The latter wallows in injustice as an excuse for inaction. This brings us to perhaps the most profound cost of a complaint-centered life: the gradual atrophy of our agency, our capacity to act as conscious, deliberate shapers of our own experience. When we persistently focus on what others should do differently, rather than what we ourselves might change, we surrender our power in small, almost imperceptible increments. Over time, this surrender becomes our default orientation to life, seeing ourselves primarily as recipients of circumstances rather than as participants in creating them. The Stoics found this orientation not only practically limiting, but existentially troubling. They believed that human dignity resides in our capacity to choose our responses, particularly in difficult situations. As Viktor Frankl, a more modern proponent of this view, would later articulate after surviving Nazi concentration camps, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. When we fill that space with complaint, rather than considered action, we forfeit the very freedom that defines us as human beings. We allow external events to determine not just our circumstances, but our character, the quality of person we become through our habitual responses to life's challenges. This forfeiture of agency also represents a misunderstanding of how change actually occurs. Meaningful transformation, whether personal or societal, rarely results from complaint alone. It emerges from persistent, directed action, often beginning with small steps that seem insignificant in isolation, but compound over time. Consider the environmental activist who spends less time complaining about corporate pollution and more time developing community recycling programs, or the employee who focuses less on criticizing company culture and more on modeling the behaviors they wish to see. In both cases, the shift from complaint to action not only produces tangible results, but also attracts allies who might have been repelled by mere negativity. The Stoics would recognize these changemakers as living in alignment with nature, not passively accepting what is wrong, but actively engaging with reality as it presents itself. Chrysippus, an early Stoic whose writings influenced those who came after him, used the metaphor of a dog tied to a cart. The dog can either be dragged along, resisting and complaining all the way, or it can choose to run alongside, maintaining its dignity and conserving its strength for matters within its control. This metaphor captures the essential Stoic insight about complaint versus action. Life will present difficulties regardless of our attitude toward them. The question is whether we will exhaust ourselves in resistance to inevitable challenges or channel our energy toward navigating them with wisdom and purpose. Even the most dedicated complainers often recognize in moments of clarity the futility of their habit. Yet they continue, not because complaint is effective, but because the alternative, taking responsibility and action, feels overwhelmingly difficult. The gap between recognizing the problem and implementing a solution can seem insurmountable. This is where the practical wisdom of Stoicism offers a bridge. Epictetus provides us with a starting point. First, say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. This simple directive contains profound insight. Before action comes identity, a vision of the person you wish to become. When we define ourselves as agents rather than victims, as creators rather than commentators, our behavior naturally shifts to align with this self-concept. Consider how differently you might approach a challenging work situation if you viewed yourself as someone who solves problems rather than someone who endures problems. The former identity propels you toward action. The latter keeps you mired in passive resignation. This shift in self-perception is often the catalyst that transforms complaint into productive engagement. Musonius Rufus, the teacher of Epictetus and another significant Stoic philosopher, emphasized the importance of practice over theory. For whether one has learned the theory of an art or has not, one should practice the art. Applied to our discussion, his wisdom suggests that the way to overcome a habit of complaint is not merely to understand its futility, but to actively practice its alternative. Taking concrete steps, however small, toward addressing the situations we find troubling. This practice begins with awareness, catching yourself in the act of complaint and interrupting the pattern. The modern Stoic practitioner might adopt a simple ritual. Whenever you notice yourself complaining, pause and ask, what is one small action I could take right now that would address this situation, even partially? The emphasis on small, immediate action is crucial, as it bypasses the paralysis that often accompanies larger challenges. A software developer frustrated with inefficient team processes might shift from complaining about management to documenting one specific workflow that could be improved. A parent exasperated by household disorder might focus less on lamenting family members' habits and more on creating systems that make organization easier. A citizen concerned about community issues might redirect energy from social media complaints to attending a local council meeting. In each case, the shift from complaint to action requires overcoming inertia, the tendency to continue in established patterns even when they yield unsatisfactory results. The Stoics recognized this inertia as one of the primary obstacles to living well. As Seneca observed, it is not because things are difficult that we do not dare, it is because we do not dare that things are difficult. This insight reveals another dimension of our complaining habit. It often serves as a protection against the risks of action. When we complain, we position ourselves as observers rather than participants, a stance that shields us from potential failure, rejection, or disappointment. If we never attempt to change our circumstances, we never have to confront our limitations or face the possibility that our efforts might fall short. The Stoics would view this risk aversion as a profound misunderstanding of what constitutes a good life. For them, virtue, expressed through wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, was the only true good, and virtue is manifested through action, not commentary. Attempting something difficult and failing while maintaining your integrity would be considered far more worthwhile than avoiding challenge through passive complaint. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, taught in the Painted Porch of Athens that happiness consists in living in agreement with nature. For humans, our nature includes the capacity for reasoned choice and deliberate action. When we abdicate this capacity by remaining in cycles of complaint, we live in opposition to our nature rather than in harmony with it. The neurological impact of this shift from complaint to action is significant. Research in neuroplasticity demonstrates that our brains physically reorganize based on repeated experience. Each time we interrupt the complaint circuit and substitute constructive action, we strengthen neural pathways associated with agency and problem-solving. Over time, this practice literally reshapes our brain's default responses to challenges. There's also a social dimension to this transformation. As you shift from complaint to action, you'll likely notice changes in your relationships. People who were once complaint partners may drift away, while those who share your commitment to constructive engagement may draw closer. Your example may inspire others to reconsider their own habits of complaint, creating ripple effects beyond your individual practice. The Stoics understood that personal transformation never occurs in isolation. Our individual choices influence and are influenced by our social context. This mutual reinforcement helps explain both why complaint cultures persist and why they can be gradually transformed through the consistent example of those who choose a different path. What makes this path particularly challenging in our current era is the unprecedented availability of platforms for complaint. Social media algorithms often amplify expressions of outrage and grievance, creating an environment where complaint is not merely normalized, but rewarded with attention and engagement. Navigating this landscape with Stoic principles requires deliberate choice about where and how we direct our attention. The modern Stoic practitioner might establish boundaries around media consumption, prioritizing information that enables constructive action over content that merely reinforces grievance. They might curate their social environments to include more individuals committed to solutions than those dedicated to problems. They might develop rituals that counter the complaint reflex, such as identifying 3 potential actions before voicing any criticism. These practices represent not a denial of life's genuine challenges, but a strategic reorientation of how we engage with them. The goal is not to ignore problems, but to approach them from a stance of agency rather than helplessness. To see in each difficulty an opportunity to exercise the distinctly human capacity for reasoned choice and deliberate action. This perspective transforms how we experience adversity itself. What once appeared as an irritation to be complained about becomes a context for growth, a chance to develop qualities that might otherwise remain dormant. The project with the impossible deadline becomes an opportunity to practice efficiency and clear communication. The difficult colleague becomes a teacher of patience and tactical empathy. The system that resists change becomes a testing ground for persistence and creative problem-solving. Marcus Aurelius captured this transformative perspective when he wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." This is perhaps the most profound Stoic insight regarding complaint versus action, that the very circumstances we're inclined to complain about often contain within them the elements of our growth and development, if only we have the wisdom to engage rather than merely comment. The practical first step in this direction is disarmingly simple. When faced with a situation that triggers complaint, ask yourself, what one small action can I take today that would address this situation, even partially? Then take that action, however modest it might seem. This practice, repeated consistently, gradually reshapes both your external circumstances and your internal landscape, replacing the habit of complaint with the habit of engaged response. This is not a call to suppress legitimate grievances or to accept injustice through inaction. Rather, it's an invitation to channel the energy of dissatisfaction into the engine of change, to become, in the words of Gandhi, who studied Stoic philosophy, the change you wish to see in the world. For the Stoics, this active engagement with reality represented not just a more effective approach to life's challenges, but the fulfillment of our purpose as rational beings capable of deliberate choice. The path from complaint to action is ultimately a path from passivity to agency, from commentary to creation, from resignation to engagement. It's a journey that begins with the recognition that while we cannot control many of the circumstances we face, we always retain control over how we respond to them, and that this response, more than the circumstances themselves, determines the quality and meaning of our lives. Sign 2. You constantly chase pleasure but still feel empty. In the relentless pursuit of pleasure, we often find ourselves trapped in a paradoxical maze of our own making. The Stoics recognized this human tendency thousands of years ago, identifying it as one of the clearest signs that we're living contrary to our nature. Consider how modern life has perfected the art of pleasure-seeking. We scroll through endless entertainment, consume delicacies from around the world at a moment's notice, and surround ourselves with comforts our ancestors couldn't imagine. Yet depression, anxiety, and a sense of meaninglessness pervade our society. This contradiction would not have surprised the ancient Stoics. The philosopher Epictetus, often misunderstood as an advocate for hedonism, actually warned against this very trap. While Epictetus believed pleasure was the highest good, he defined pleasure quite differently than we might expect. He advocated for simple pleasures, conversation with friends, freedom from pain, and peace of mind. The Epicurean approach cautioned against the excess that modern society embraces. Stoics took this understanding even further. Seneca, one of Stoicism's most eloquent voices, observed, "While we wait for life, life passes." This penetrating insight cuts to the heart of our modern condition. We delay our true living, postponing meaning and purpose, while we indulge in fleeting pleasures that promise satisfaction, but deliver only temporary distraction. We're constantly chasing the next dopamine hit, the next purchase, the next show, the next meal, always believing that just around the corner lies the pleasure that will finally fulfill us. But this pursuit is fundamentally flawed because of what psychologists now call the hedonic treadmill. This phenomenon explains why lottery winners often return to their baseline happiness after the initial euphoria fades. Our minds are remarkably adaptive. What thrills us today becomes our expected baseline tomorrow, pushing us to seek ever more intense pleasures to achieve the same emotional response. The ancient Romans understood this. Despite their reputation for excess, their wisest thinkers recognized the diminishing returns of pleasure-seeking. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does or thinks, but only to what he does himself, that it may be just and pure." Here, the emperor-philosopher identifies how our pleasure-seeking often becomes comparative. We want not just pleasure, but more pleasure than others, fueling an endless cycle of insatiable desire. The Stoics proposed a radical alternative. Instead of chasing hedonic pleasures, we should orient ourselves toward eudaimonic well-being, happiness derived from purpose, virtue, and meaningful contribution. This isn't to say pleasure has no place in the Stoic life. Rather, the Stoics understood that pleasure is most meaningful when it arrives as a byproduct of purposeful living, not as its primary aim. Consider how often we use pleasure as escape rather than enhancement. We binge-watch shows not because they bring us joy, but because they distract us from discomfort. We overindulge in food or drink not for the appreciation of flavor, but to numb emotional pain. The Stoics would argue that these behaviors don't represent pleasure in its truest form, but are instead symptoms of a life misaligned with deeper values. The Stoic critique of pleasure-seeking goes deeper still. They understood that our relationship with pleasure often becomes pathological. We don't just enjoy pleasures, we become dependent on them. Epictetus, who began his life as a slave before becoming one of Stoicism's most profound teachers, cautioned, "Wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants." This inversion of conventional thinking cuts to the core of our modern discontent. We've built an economy and culture around multiplying desires rather than cultivating satisfaction with what is sufficient. This Stoic insight finds unexpected support in contemporary neuroscience. Research has repeatedly shown that the brain's reward pathways, when overstimulated, become less sensitive over time. The dopamine receptors that signal pleasure and satisfaction begin to downregulate, requiring ever more stimulus to achieve the same effect. What begins as enjoyment transforms into dependency, and what once satisfied leaves us wanting more. The ancient Stoics recognized this pattern without the benefit of brain scans or neurochemical analysis. They observed it in human behavior. Musonius Rufus, sometimes called the Roman Socrates, taught that we should choose the meal not for pleasure but for nourishment, not to please our palate but to maintain our health. This principle extends far beyond food. The Stoics would argue that we should choose our entertainment not merely for distraction but for enrichment, our possessions not for status but for genuine utility, our relationships not for validation but for mutual growth. When we invert these priorities, choosing pleasure over purpose, we unwittingly diminish our capacity for genuine fulfillment. The irony of pleasure-seeking becomes apparent When we consider those moments in life we later recall as most meaningful, rarely are they times of pure indulgence or ease. More often, they're moments of challenge overcome, connection deepened through adversity, or purpose realized through effort. The runner who pushes through pain to finish a marathon, the parent who sacrifices sleep to care for a child, the artist who labors in obscurity for years before achieving mastery, these experiences contain a quality of satisfaction that passive consumption can never match. Consider Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, who began his philosophical journey after surviving a shipwreck that destroyed his commercial cargo. Having lost his material wealth, he found himself in Athens, where he encountered Socratic philosophy. What could have been viewed as catastrophic misfortune became the catalyst for a philosophical tradition that would influence human thought for millennia. Had Zeno prioritized the restoration of his comfortable merchant lifestyle, the world might never have known Stoicism. Our modern experience reflects this ancient wisdom in unexpected ways. Studies consistently show that beyond meeting basic needs, additional wealth and consumption produce diminishing returns in happiness. The countries with the highest consumption rates don't report the highest levels of well-being. The individuals with the most toys are not necessarily the most fulfilled. Something essential is missing from the equation of pleasure and satisfaction. That missing element, according to the Stoics, is virtue, the cultivation of excellence in character and action. Virtue in the Stoic sense isn't about moral superiority or judgment of others. Rather, it's about aligning our behavior with our deepest nature as rational, social beings capable of contribution and growth. When we substitute the pursuit of pleasure for the pursuit of virtue, we exchange lasting fulfillment for momentary distraction. The Stoics understood that pleasure itself isn't the enemy. In fact, pleasures can enhance a well-lived life. The problem emerges when we invert the natural order, making pleasure our primary aim, rather than a welcome companion to purposeful living. As Seneca noted, to be everywhere is to be nowhere. When we scatter our attention across endless diversions and indulgences, we lose the focus necessary to build anything of lasting value, including our own character. This insight becomes particularly relevant in our age of unprecedented abundance and choice. Never before has humanity had access to so many varieties of pleasure, so many forms of entertainment, so many comforts and conveniences. Yet this abundance hasn't delivered corresponding fulfillment. If anything, it has intensified our confusion about what constitutes a well-lived life. When everything is available, how do we choose what truly matters? The Stoics would suggest that this question itself reveals our misorientation. When we frame life primarily in terms of what we can get from it, what pleasures we can extract, what comforts we can secure, we've already begun down a path that leads to spiritual poverty, regardless of material wealth. The alternative is to ask what we can give, what excellence we can cultivate, what contribution we can make. These questions orient us toward purpose rather than pleasure, toward meaning rather than momentary satisfaction. The path forward, according to Stoic wisdom, involves a fundamental reorientation of our relationship with pleasure and pain. Rather than avoiding discomfort at all costs, the Stoics advocated for voluntary discomfort as a practice, not from masochism, but from the recognition that our capacity to endure difficulty is a muscle that atrophies without use. Seneca, despite his immense wealth, regularly practiced periods of voluntary poverty, eating simple foods and sleeping on a hard pallet. This wasn't performative asceticism, but practical training for life's inevitable challenges. Set aside a certain number of days, Seneca advised, during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, "Is this the condition that I feared?" This practice builds psychological resilience that no amount of pleasure-seeking can provide. The person who has learned to be content with little cannot be controlled by the fear of loss, a freedom more valuable than any luxury. Modern psychologists call this anti-fragility, the quality of growing stronger under stress rather than merely resisting it. The Stoics understood that our fear of discomfort often causes more suffering than discomfort itself. By intentionally embracing challenge, we dissolve the power that potential hardship holds over our imagination. The runner who trains in adverse weather builds not just physical endurance, but mental fortitude that serves in all aspects of life. This approach stands in stark contrast to our culture's promise that technology and convenience will eliminate all friction from human experience. The Stoics would argue that a life without meaningful resistance is not a life optimized for flourishing, but one designed for stagnation. Just as muscles require resistance to grow, character requires challenge to develop. When we organize our lives around the elimination of difficulty, we inadvertently sabotage our capacity for growth. Ancient Stoics practiced what modern psychologists call negative visualization, the deliberate contemplation of losing what we value. Far from being morbid, this practice cultivates genuine appreciation for what we have while it's here. By contemplating the impermanence of health, relationships, and life itself, we strip away the veil of entitlement that dulls our experience. Paradoxically, acknowledging that nothing lasts forever allows us to be fully present with what exists now. The Stoic alternative to pleasure-seeking isn't joyless denial, but purposeful engagement. When we align our actions with meaningful values, contribution, excellence, integrity, growth, we experience a deeper form of satisfaction that doesn't diminish with repetition. The craftsperson who loses track of time while perfecting their work, the teacher who witnesses a student's breakthrough, the friend who shows up consistently in times of need, these experiences generate fulfillment that outlasts any fleeting pleasure. True happiness is to enjoy the present without anxious dependence upon the future, Seneca observed. This insight reveals how pleasure-seeking often keeps us perpetually oriented toward what comes next, rather than what is here now. We finish one meal thinking of the next, complete one project already focused on another, reach one goal only to immediately set our sights further. This forward orientation, while useful for planning, becomes pathological when it prevents us from inhabiting our actual lives as they unfold. The Stoics propose a radical reconsideration of what constitutes the good life. Rather than defining success in terms of pleasures accumulated or pains avoided, they suggest measuring life by virtues expressed, wisdom in our decisions, justice in our dealings with others, courage in facing difficulty, and temperance in managing our desires. This framework shifts our attention from what happens to us to how we respond to whatever happens. Even in our consumption-driven society, we see evidence that purpose trumps pleasure. Studies consistently show that expenditures on experiences that connect us with others or contribute to personal growth produce more lasting satisfaction than purchases of material goods. Donations to meaningful causes activate brain regions associated with reward more powerfully than spending on ourselves. Volunteering correlates with greater longevity and reported well-being. These findings wouldn't surprise the Stoics, who recognize that human beings are fundamentally social creatures who thrive on meaningful contribution. The most profound Stoic insight might be that pleasure-seeking fails not because pleasure itself is problematic, but because it makes a poor organizing principle for a human life. When pleasure becomes our primary aim, it paradoxically becomes more elusive. Like happiness, it arrives most reliably when pursued indirectly, as a byproduct of a life well lived rather than as its central objective. Epictetus, who knew suffering intimately, taught that true freedom comes not from satisfying all desires, but from carefully examining which desires deserve our allegiance. Freedom is not procured by a full enjoyment of what is desired, he noted, but by controlling desire. This isn't about denying our humanity, but about directing it wisely, distinguishing between fleeting urges and enduring values, between momentary wants and genuine needs. The discipline the Stoics advocate isn't about rigid self-denial, but about intentional choice. The capacity to pause between stimulus and response, to ask whether a particular pleasure serves our deeper purposes or distracts from them. This discernment allows us to enjoy pleasures without being enslaved by them, to appreciate comfort without requiring it, to participate in the world's delights without making them the center of our existence. Perhaps most importantly, the Stoic approach recognizes that meaning doesn't emerge spontaneously from comfortable circumstances. Meaning arises from engagement with challenge, from overcoming obstacles, from serving purposes larger than our immediate gratification. The person who organizes their life around avoiding discomfort inadvertently avoids the very experiences that would give life its depth and significance. Consider the difference between climbing a mountain and viewing it from a distance. The observer sees the beauty, but misses the transformative experience of the climber, who knows the mountain's contours intimately through effort and persistence. The Stoics would argue that too often we choose to be spectators of life rather than full participants, consuming experiences rather than being changed by them. This spectator approach manifests in our relationship with knowledge itself. We consume information passively, reading philosophy without applying it, accumulating facts without integrating them into our lives, collecting wisdom without allowing it to transform our behavior. The Stoics insisted that philosophy is not primarily theoretical, but practical, not something we know, but something we do. Knowledge that doesn't alter action remains inert, regardless of how impressive it might sound in conversation. The application of Stoic wisdom to our modern predicament requires more than philosophical understanding. It demands practical implementation. We might intellectually recognize the limitations of pleasure-seeking while continuing to organize our lives around it through force of habit and cultural conditioning. Breaking this pattern requires deliberate practice. Consider how our digital landscape has been engineered precisely to exploit the hedonic treadmill. Social media platforms, streaming services, and mobile applications employ teams of behavioral scientists to maximize engagement, a sanitized term for addiction. Each notification, each autoplay feature, each infinite scroll mechanism capitalizes on our neurological vulnerability to novelty and variable reward schedules. The Stoics couldn't have anticipated these sophisticated manipulation techniques, but their philosophy provides the antidote. A modern Stoic practice might begin with attention audit, a careful examination of where our focus goes throughout the day. This isn't about productivity in the conventional sense, but about alignment. Are we directing our limited attention toward what we genuinely value, or are we allowing it to be captured by whatever shouts loudest for our consideration? The person who claims to value family connection while spending hours mindlessly scrolling has not just a time management problem, but an attention allocation crisis. The Stoic concept of proairesis, the capacity for choice, becomes particularly relevant here. Each moment offers the opportunity to choose our response to circumstances, to select where our attention goes, to determine which impulses we act upon and which we merely observe. This doesn't require grand gestures, but consistent redirection. The small daily choices that cumulatively shape a life's trajectory. Modern neuroscience confirms what the Stoics intuited. Attention shapes experience. Whatever we repeatedly focus on becomes our reality, not just perceptually, but neurologically, as neural pathways strengthen through use and atrophy through neglect. When we habitually focus on what's lacking or what's next, we literally train our brains to overlook present fulfillment. The philosopher Pierre Hadot described ancient philosophical practices as spiritual exercises, not in any religious sense, but as trainings of the soul or psyche. These practices weren't theoretical, but embodied, designed to transform not just thought, but perception and action. Similarly, modern Stoic practice requires embodied engagement, not just understanding pleasure's limitations intellectually, but experiencing the liberation that comes from loosening its hold on our behavior. This might manifest as intermittent fasting, cold exposure, media fasts, or digital minimalism, practices that intentionally interrupt patterns of comfort-seeking to recalibrate our relationship with desire. These aren't acts of self-punishment, but of reclamation, taking back the autonomy that excessive comfort gradually erodes. When we discover we can be content without constant stimulation, without immediate gratification, we recover freedom that many never realize they've surrendered. Marcus Aurelius advised, "When jarred unavoidably by circumstances, revert at once to yourself and don't lose the rhythm more than you can help. You'll have a better grasp of the harmony if you keep going back to it." This rhythmic return to center, to our deeper purposes and values, provides stability amid life's inevitable fluctuations. Rather than being perpetually destabilized by the pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of discomfort, we establish an internal reference point that transcends circumstance. This stability allows for a more mature relationship with pleasure itself. Rather than treating it as life's primary aim, we can appreciate it as one element of a well-lived life, to be enjoyed without attachment, savored without dependency. pleasure becomes not a desperate necessity, but a graceful complement to a life organized around meaning. The Stoics recognized that genuine joy, what they called eupatheia or good feelings, arises not from passive consumption but from aligned action. The satisfaction of making progress in meaningful work, of maintaining integrity amid challenge, of contributing to others' well-being. These experiences generate sustainable positive emotion that doesn't diminish with repetition. Unlike hedonic pleasure, which requires ever-increasing stimulation to maintain the same effect, virtuous action produces renewable satisfaction. Contemporary psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's research on flow states, those experiences of complete absorption in optimally challenging activity, confirms this ancient wisdom. Flow experiences correlate strongly with reported life satisfaction, yet they often involve difficulty rather than ease. The rock climber solving a challenging route, the musician mastering a complex piece, the writer finding the perfect phrase. These experiences contain an element of challenge that passive pleasure-seeking deliberately avoids. Perhaps most counterintuitively, the Stoic approach to pleasure includes gratitude for difficulties themselves. What stands in the way becomes the way, Marcus Aurelius observed, recognizing that obstacles provide the very conditions necessary for growth and meaning. The person hoping to build strength cannot resent resistance. It's the essential element that makes progress possible. Similarly, character development requires challenge, not as an unfortunate necessity, but as the very substance of meaningful living. This reframing transforms our experience of difficulty from something to be avoided at all costs to something that can be appreciated for its developmental potential. The promotion we didn't receive, the relationship that ended, the illness that limited certain activities. These experiences, while painful, often catalyze growth that comfort never could have stimulated. The Stoics didn't suggest seeking suffering, but finding meaning within whatever circumstances life presents. In practical terms, this might mean establishing what modern psychologists call via negativa goals, defining success not by what we acquire or achieve, but by what we avoid or eliminate. Success might mean not checking email before being fully present with family in the morning, not reaching for the phone during moments of boredom, not distracting ourselves from difficult emotions with consumption. These negative space practices create the conditions for meaning to emerge naturally. The ultimate Stoic insight regarding pleasure might be that it makes a wonderful servant, but a terrible master. When pleasure directs our lives, it leads inevitably to diminishing returns and increasing dependency. When purpose directs our lives, with pleasure as an occasional companion rather than a constant necessity, we discover a form of fulfillment that doesn't fade with repetition or require escalation. This approach doesn't reject the world's delights, but places them in proper perspective, as temporary gifts to be appreciated without clinging, as pleasant accompaniments to a life organized around deeper values. The capacity to enjoy without attachment, to partake without dependency, to appreciate without craving. This represents true freedom, the liberation that comes not from having every desire fulfilled, but from having fewer desires that control us. The person who has escaped the pleasure trap doesn't live in perpetual denial or ascetic rejection of life's offerings. Rather, they engage with life's full spectrum, its pleasures and pains, its comforts and challenges, with equal presence and equanimity. They enjoy without being defined by enjoyment. They suffer without being defined by suffering, finding identity instead in the choices they make and the values they express regardless of circumstance. This freedom represents the ultimate Stoic achievement, not the impossible goal of avoiding all discomfort, but the attainable goal of finding tranquility amid life's inevitable fluctuations. The happiness of your life, Marcus Aurelius wrote, depends upon the quality of your thoughts. When we release the exhausting pursuit of constant pleasure and the equally exhausting avoidance of all discomfort, we discover a more sustainable relationship with existence itself, one that generates not just fleeting happiness, but enduring fulfillment. Sign 3, you fear the opinions of others more than your own values. Live your own life, for you will die your own death. This ancient Stoic wisdom cuts to the heart of our third sign, you're living the wrong life. Fearing the opinions of others more than your own values. When we surrender the steering wheel of our existence to external validation, We embark on a journey not of our own choosing, one that inevitably leads to a destination of profound regret. Picture yourself at 80 years old, sitting quietly with your memories. Will you look back with satisfaction at having lived authentically, or will you confront the haunting realization that you lived as an imposter in your own life? For too many, this reflection becomes unbearable as they recognize how completely they've allowed others to script their one precious existence. The ancient Stoics identified this trap millennia ago, yet we continue to fall into it with remarkable consistency. We sacrifice our deepest aspirations on the altar of social approval, trading authentic expression for momentary validation. This bargain might appear reasonable in the short term. Acceptance feels good, rejection hurts, but the accumulated cost over decades becomes soul-crushing. Epictetus, who experienced life both as a slave and later as a revered teacher, offered a provocative remedy. If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Consider the radical freedom contained in these words. To improve, to truly evolve, often requires venturing beyond conventional wisdom into territory others find threatening or absurd. The moment you become willing to appear foolish in pursuit of your values is the moment you strike the first blow against your social imprisonment. This imprisonment manifests in countless subtle ways. It appears in the promising artist who abandons their craft for a sensible career that impresses at dinner parties. It reveals itself in the person who stays in a dysfunctional relationship because divorce would invite uncomfortable questions. It shows in the entrepreneur who never launches their vision because family members mock it as unrealistic. Each compromise creates distance between who you are and who you pretend to be, gradually hollowing out your existence. The social prison operates through sophisticated mechanisms. First comes the threat of rejection. Humans are tribal creatures, and ostracism once meant death. Next comes the promise of approval, the warm glow of acceptance and admiration when we conform. Finally comes internalization. We begin to identify with our prison, mistaking its walls for protection rather than constraint. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome and dedicated Stoic, wrote in his private journals, "I have often wondered how it is that every person loves themselves more than others, but yet cares more about the opinion of others than their own." This paradox illuminates our predicament. We inherently value our own experience, yet routinely subordinate that experience to external judgment. The weight of social expectation has crushed more potential, silenced more truths, and diverted more authentic paths than perhaps any other force in human psychology. When we continually calibrate our behavior to others' reactions, we become performers rather than participants in our own lives. Consider the profound toll this takes on authenticity. Every time you filter a genuine impulse through the lens of what will they think, you weaken your connection to your true nature. This self-alienation accumulates, creating the unsettling sense of being a stranger to yourself that characterizes many midlife crises. The ancient Stoics understood reputation as an indifferent, neither inherently good nor bad, and crucially outside our control. Seneca observed that the opinion of the masses is not to be respected, noting how quickly public approval could shift with changing winds. The same public that cheers you today might condemn you tomorrow for identical actions, depending on circumstantial factors entirely beyond your influence. History consistently vindicates this Stoic position. Those who altered the course of human events, from artists to scientists to moral leaders, first had to withstand waves of criticism, mockery, and rejection. Socrates, philosophical forefather of Stoicism, was sentenced to death partly for corrupting the youth of Athens by encouraging independent thought. His commitment to his values cost him his life, yet his influence has shaped philosophy for millennia. The world would be immeasurably poorer had he compromised his principles to appease his critics. Our neurological wiring amplifies this challenge. Evolution has programmed us to feel intense discomfort when faced with social disapproval. Modern neuroscience demonstrates that social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. We are literally hardwired to experience psychological distress when sensing disapproval from others. This evolutionary adaptation suited our ancestors' simple tribal environments, but has become deeply maladaptive in our complex modern world. Social media has exponentially intensified this tendency, creating environments where we're exposed to the potential judgment of thousands or millions, rather than just our immediate clan. The dopamine reward of likes, shares, and positive comments establishes powerful feedback loops that can dictate our behavior, beliefs, and life choices without our conscious awareness. The most insidious aspect of living for validation is its nature as a moving target. External standards constantly shift, leaving the validation seeker perpetually chasing a horizon that continuously recedes. What impresses others today becomes ordinary tomorrow. The praise received for one achievement quickly fades, demanding ever greater performances to maintain the same level of approval. This treadmill guarantees exhaustion without destination. Many discover this trap only after decades of running, when they realize that all their achievements have failed to deliver the sense of wholeness they sought. They've constructed a life optimized for others' perceptions rather than their own fulfillment. The Stoic alternative begins with a fundamental recalibration, recognizing that while we cannot control others' opinions, we maintain complete jurisdiction over our response to those opinions. Epictetus framed this distinction precisely. Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. This recalibration requires confronting uncomfortable truths. We must acknowledge how deeply we've internalized external expectations, how frequently we abandon our authentic voice for social harmony, and how habitually we measure our worth through others' eyes rather than our own values. The journey from social validation to authentic living requires more than philosophical understanding. It demands practical action. The Stoics were not mere theoreticians, but practitioners who developed specific techniques to break free from the prison of others' opinions. The first step toward liberation comes in distinguishing between reputation and character. Seneca clarified this distinction, writing, "What difference does it make how many people know you? You yourself should be the focus of your attention." The Stoics recognized that reputation, what others think of you, exists in their minds, beyond your control. Character, who you truly are, exists within you, fully under your governance. This distinction isn't semantic, but transformative. When you prioritize character over reputation, you redirect your finite energy from impression management to genuine development. Instead of asking, "How will this make me look?" you ask, "Is this aligned with my deepest values?" This reorientation provides an internal compass that remains steady regardless of external storms. Musonius Rufus, the teacher of Epictetus, advocated this approach through deliberate countercultural action. He encouraged his students to occasionally violate social norms that lacked ethical foundation, eating simple food at lavish banquets, wearing plain clothing at formal events, speaking truth when silence was expected. These weren't acts of rebellion for rebellion's sake, but purposeful exercises to strengthen the will against social pressure. Consider how rarely we exercise this capacity in modern life. We meticulously curate our social media personas, rehearse our comments before speaking in groups, and continuously scan our environment for cues about how to behave. This hypervigilance represents an exhausting expenditure of psychological resources that could otherwise fuel creativity, connection, and contribution. The philosopher Zeno, founder of Stoicism, famously said that a wise person would even be willing to be stretched on the rack if necessary, rather than betray the truth. While extreme, this position highlights the ultimate Stoic commitment to integrity over approval. Most of us will never face such dramatic choices, but we confront their smaller equivalents daily. Speaking an uncomfortable truth versus maintaining pleasant falsehood, pursuing a meaningful path versus following conventional wisdom, honoring personal boundaries versus pleasing others. Each time we choose truth over approval, we strengthen what the Stoics called our ruling faculty, the part of ourselves capable of independent judgment. With repetition, these choices create a virtuous cycle. The more we act from internal values rather than external validation, the easier such actions become, and the more genuine satisfaction they provide. This progression reveals another Stoic insight. Living by your values actually creates sustainable happiness, while chasing approval generates only temporary relief. When you act in alignment with your core principles, You experience what psychologists now call eudaimonic well-being, a sense of purpose, meaning, and authenticity. This form of happiness proves resilient against external circumstances, including others' disapproval. Epictetus captured this paradoxical wisdom. If you seek to please others, you have compromised your integrity. If you seek to live with integrity, you will inevitably displease some. The validation seeker perpetually sacrifices integrity for approval, only to discover that both eventually slip away. The integrity-focused individual may face criticism, but builds an unshakable foundation for genuine fulfillment. The social cost of authenticity varies across contexts. Some environments punish nonconformity severely, and the Stoics were realists about such situations. Marcus Aurelius advised, "When you cannot change the environment, change how you respond to it." This might mean maintaining internal disagreement while outwardly conforming in truly threatening scenarios, or strategically choosing battles worth fighting. However, we typically overestimate these costs. Research in social psychology reveals the spotlight effect. Our tendency to believe others notice and judge us far more than they actually do. Most people remain primarily concerned with their own appearance and reputation, paying only fleeting attention to our choices. This understanding liberates us from much unnecessary anxiety about judgment. Moreover, authentic living often earns deeper respect than people-pleasing. While initial nonconformity might raise eyebrows, consistent integrity eventually commands admiration. Even critics secretly respect those with the courage to live by conviction. As Theodore Roosevelt observed, echoing Stoic principles, "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena." The final stage in overcoming the fear of others' opinions involves proactive value definition. Without clear personal values, we default to adopting the values of our surroundings. The Stoics emphasized regular reflection on core principles as essential to a well-lived life. Heracles, a later Stoic, developed the circles of concern exercise, visualizing yourself at the center of expanding circles representing family, friends, community, and humanity. This practice helps clarify what truly matters to you at each level of connection, revealing values that might otherwise remain implicit or externally determined. Modern psychological research confirms the importance of explicit value identification. Studies show that people who can articulate their core values demonstrate greater resilience against social pressure and make more consistent decisions across contexts. Yet most people struggle to name 5 values they consider non-negotiable. Without this clarity, they become vulnerable to the loudest voices or strongest personalities in their environment. The process of defining values requires ruthless honesty. You must distinguish between aspirational values, what you believe you should care about, and operational values, what actually drives your behavior. The gap between these often explains the dissonance many experience, claiming to value family while consistently prioritizing work, or espousing creativity while choosing security at every turn. Epictetus advised regular examination of impressions. Don't let the force of an impression sweep you away. Say to it, "Wait for me a little. Let me see what you are and what you represent." Applied to values clarification, this means questioning inherited or assumed values. Do you value career advancement because it truly fulfills you, or because your parents instilled its importance? Do you pursue certain lifestyle markers because they bring joy, or because they signal success to peers? Once clarified, values provide decision-making infrastructure. When facing choices large or small, you can ask, which option best serves my core values? This creates consistency across life domains and reduces vulnerability to others' expectations. The anxiety of, what will they think, diminishes when replaced with, what matters most to me? Practicing value-aligned action despite disapproval builds what modern psychologists call psychological flexibility, the ability to persist in meaningful behavior regardless of internal or external resistance. This capacity correlates strongly with mental health and life satisfaction. The Stoics developed this flexibility through progressively challenging social exercises, voluntarily enduring mild discomfort and disapproval to strengthen their resistance to crowd psychology. Musonius Rufus taught that values implementation requires preparation for criticism. We must rehearse responses to expected disapproval. When you anticipate negative reactions to value-aligned choices, mentally rehearsing calm, principle-based responses reduces their impact. This preparation prevents being caught off guard and reverting to people-pleasing under pressure. The liberation from others' opinions creates space for genuine connection. Paradoxically, relationships deepen when we stop performing and start authenticating. Those attracted to your genuine self prove more compatible long-term than those responding to your performance. Those repelled by authenticity would eventually become sources of resentment anyway. Seneca emphasized this in his letters. Associate with those who will make you better. He recognized that value-aligned relationships create positive reinforcement cycles, while validation-seeking relationships perpetuate inauthenticity. This selective association doesn't mean isolating from different perspectives, but rather prioritizing connections that support growth over those that demand conformity. The ultimate Stoic freedom comes in recognizing the impermanence of all judgment. Marcus Aurelius meditated on this reality. Soon you will have forgotten all things, and soon all things will have forgotten you. The opinions that seem so consequential today will vanish entirely, both those favoring and opposing you. This cosmic perspective renders social approval profoundly trivial compared to living with integrity during our brief existence. This Stoic wisdom anticipates modern terror management theory, which demonstrates that awareness of mortality shifts priorities toward meaning and away from social conformity. When we acknowledge life's brevity, the absurdity of sacrificing authentic expression for temporary approval becomes self-evident. As Seneca asked, what difference does it make how long a life you have if it isn't a life that belongs to you? Implementing these Stoic principles transforms daily experience. The constant background anxiety of potential judgment diminishes. Decision-making becomes clearer and more efficient, no longer clouded by speculative reactions. Creative expression flows more naturally without self-censorship. Relationships deepen through genuine interaction rather than careful curation. Most significantly, you reclaim ownership of your life's narrative. Instead of living reactively to others' expectations, a character in someone else's story, you become the author of your experience. This authorship constitutes the fundamental Stoic freedom, the liberty to assign meaning according to your values rather than external validation. The path from social imprisonment to authentic living isn't completed in a day. It requires consistent practice, regular reinforcement, and patient self-correction when you inevitably slip into old patterns. The Stoics emphasized progress over perfection, viewing philosophy as daily practice rather than abstract knowledge. Begin with small acts of authenticity where stakes remain low. Express an unpopular but considered opinion in a safe context. Decline an invitation that conflicts with your values. Create something without sharing it for validation. Each exercise strengthens your capacity for larger authentic actions when they matter most. Remember Epictetus's fundamental distinction: make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. You cannot control others' opinions, but you maintain complete authority over your response to those opinions. In reclaiming this authority, you discover the true meaning of Stoic freedom. Not freedom from judgment, but freedom from judgment's power over your choices. This liberation represents perhaps the greatest gift Stoicism offers modern humanity: the quiet dignity of living according to inner values in a world obsessed with external validation. As you cultivate this practice, you'll recognize that true wealth lies not in others' approval, but in the unshakable integrity of a life authentically lived. Sign 4. You feel trapped in routine but do nothing to change it. The steady drone of your alarm clock pierces the silence each morning, a sound you've come to dread. Your hand reaches out, muscle memory guiding you to the snooze button. 10 more minutes of respite before facing another day that will unfold exactly like yesterday, and the day before that, and the one before that. The morning routine you execute with robotic precision. The commute where you recognize the same faces day after day, all wearing the same blank expressions. 8 hours at a desk that has molded itself to your body's contours over the years. The evening ritual of mindless scrolling, perhaps a drink to dull the edges, then sleep before it all begins again. This is existence, not living. and deep inside you know it. The ancient Stoics would look upon this modern predicament with grim recognition. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome and Stoic philosopher, wrote in his personal journals what might be the most haunting indictment of this way of life. It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live. Consider for a moment the weight of these words from a man who carried the burdens of an empire on his shoulders. Even as he commanded legions and managed the affairs of the most powerful civilization on earth, Marcus worried about the same thing that keeps many of us awake at night: the possibility of reaching the end, having never truly lived. Look around at your colleagues, your neighbors, perhaps even your closest friends. How many of them speak of dreams deferred, of someday plans, of things they'll do when the time is right, the promotion they'll seek once they have more experience, the novel they'll write when the kids are grown, the travels they'll embark on after retirement. Always later, always tomorrow, always beyond the horizon of now. And yet tomorrow becomes today, and nothing changes. The routine remains unbroken, a perfect circle of comfortable misery. What the Stoics understood with painful clarity is that this postponement is not merely procrastination. It is a profound moral failure. To recognize the cage and yet remain within it willingly is to betray your own potential. Seneca, another Stoic philosopher, observed that life is long enough, and it has been given in sufficiently generous measure to allow the accomplishment of the very greatest things if the whole of it is well invested. The tragedy is not in having too little time, but in wasting what we have. The question that haunts those trapped in routine is always the same: why don't I change? The answers come readily enough: responsibilities, obligations, financial security, the comfort of the known versus the terror of the unknown. These justifications sound reasonable, even prudent. But beneath them lurks something far more primal: fear. Fear of failure stands as the colossus blocking the path to change. We imagine every possible negative outcome in vivid detail: the rejection letter, the business that collapses, the relationship that ends in heartbreak. Our minds, so adept at constructing worst-case scenarios, become architects of elaborate justifications for inaction. Better to remain unsatisfied than risk devastation, we tell ourselves, as if contentment were merely a luxury, rather than a necessity for a life well lived. Yet the Stoics would point out a crucial truth: the anticipation of pain is almost always worse than the pain itself. Epictetus, who knew suffering intimately, having lived as a slave before becoming a philosopher, taught that it is not things that disturb men, but their judgments about things. The fear of failure is often a phantom, a shadow cast by our judgments rather than by reality itself. Consider those moments when you finally faced something you had dreaded: a difficult conversation, a challenging task, a long-avoided decision. How often was the reality less terrible than the anticipation? How frequently did you emerge thinking, that wasn't as bad as I thought it would be? The mind is expert at magnifying potential pain while minimizing the agony of stagnation. What makes this trap particularly insidious is that routine offers the illusion of safety while slowly draining life of its vitality. Each day that passes in familiar patterns feels harmless enough, comfortable even. But these days accumulate, building into years and decades, until one day you look back and see not a life fully lived, but a series of repetitions, a pale imitation of what might have been. The most painful irony is that many who feel trapped understand exactly what they should do. They can name the changes needed with perfect clarity: the job they should quit, the relationship they should end or repair, the habits they should break, the risks they should take. Knowledge is not the problem, action is. The Stoics were not idle dreamers prescribing reckless abandonment of responsibility. Rather, they advocated for the courage to make deliberate choices rather than drifting with the current of circumstance. They understood that freedom comes not from the absence of constraint, but from the exercise of will within those constraints. So what is the path forward for those caught in routine's web? The Stoic answer is deceptively simple. Take small, deliberate steps. Momentum is not built through grand gestures, but through consistent action. There is no perfect moment waiting on the horizon. There is only now, and the choice to move, however slightly, in a new direction. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of routine-induced paralysis is how it silently reshapes your identity. When you repeatedly tell yourself, "I'll change tomorrow," but tomorrow never comes, you begin to internalize a new narrative. I am someone who doesn't follow through. This self-definition becomes a prison more confining than any external circumstance could ever be. The Stoics understood that our character is formed not by our thoughts or intentions, but by our actions. As Aristotle, though not a Stoic himself, famously observed, "We are what we repeatedly do." This transformation happens beneath conscious awareness. The first time you postpone a decision to change, it feels like a temporary delay. The 10th time, it feels like prudence. The 100th time, it feels like an immutable fact about who you are. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. You don't take action because you don't see yourself as someone who takes action, and you don't see yourself that way because you haven't taken action. The loop tightens with each passing day. Consider the story of Agrippinus, a Roman senator whom Epictetus admired. When Nero's tyranny became unbearable, many senators compromised their principles to survive. Agrippinus refused. When asked why he wouldn't simply conform like the others, he replied, "I am not the sort of thread that's part of the common cloth." He recognized that each compromise would alter not just his circumstances, but his very self. This clarity about who he was and who he refused to become gave him the strength to break from the deadly routine of compliance that had trapped his peers. The psychological toll of remaining in an unfulfilling routine manifests in subtle ways before becoming overwhelming. There's the creeping sense of envy when you encounter others who have taken risks you've avoided. There's the reflexive cynicism toward those pursuing their passions, dismissing them as naive or privileged. There's the growing need for escapism, whether through entertainment, substances, or other distractions, to numb the awareness of time passing without purpose. These are not character flaws, but symptoms of a life misaligned with your deepest values. What makes this situation particularly painful is that we live in an era of unprecedented possibility. Never before have so many had such freedom to choose their path. For most of human history, life's trajectory was largely determined by birth. The farmer's son became a farmer. The blacksmith's daughter married and managed a household. Modern life offers choices that would have seemed like fantasy to our ancestors. Yet with this expansion of freedom comes a paralyzing burden of decision. When anything is possible, choosing one path means rejecting countless others. The Stoics would recognize this as the anxiety of infinite possibility. Their solution was refreshingly practical. Focus not on what you might do, but on what you can do today. As Marcus Aurelius advised himself, do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good. This isn't morbid pessimism, but clear-eyed realism that cuts through indecision. Many mistake the Stoic emphasis on accepting what cannot be changed as passive resignation. Nothing could be further from their teaching. The Stoic dichotomy of control, distinguishing between what we can and cannot influence, was meant to concentrate our energy on effective action, not justify inaction. Epictetus taught his students to say, "Some things are up to us, and some things are not up to us." The purpose was to stop wasting energy on circumstances beyond control and redirect that energy toward what could be changed. The Roman Stoics were particularly focused on practical action rather than theoretical wisdom. Seneca, though enormously wealthy, regularly practiced voluntary hardship. Sleeping on a hard mattress, wearing simple clothes, eating plain food, not from asceticism, but to prove to himself that the changes he feared were not as terrible as his imagination suggested. By deliberately experiencing discomfort, he inoculated himself against the fear of loss that keeps many trapped in unsatisfying routines. This practice reveals a profound psychological insight. We overestimate our need for comfort and underestimate our capacity for adaptation. The brain habituates quickly to changed circumstances, whether positive or negative. Studies of lottery winners and accident victims find that after an initial period of elation or despair, most return to their baseline level of happiness. The hedonic treadmill, as psychologists call it, suggests that dramatic life changes, even those we fear, will not impact our long-term well-being as much as we imagine. Yet knowing this intellectually does little to dispel the emotional resistance to change. the gap between understanding and action remains. Here, the Stoics offer another insight. Rationality alone cannot overcome fear. Emotional habits must be reshaped through experience. Musonius Rufus, the teacher of Epictetus, insisted that philosophy wasn't just about learning principles, but practicing them. For a person to hear the teachings but never practice, he said, is like a man going to a doctor for treatment, but never following his prescriptions. What might this practice look like for someone trapped in routine? It begins with small disruptions to the patterns that have calcified around daily life. Take a different route to work, speak to colleagues you normally avoid, say yes to an invitation you would typically decline. These minor deviations create small fractures in the shell of habit, proving that change, however modest, is possible. From these tiny beginnings, momentum builds. Neuroscience confirms what the Stoics intuited. Action precedes motivation, not the other way around. Waiting to feel motivated before acting ensures perpetual stasis. The secret is to act first, however mechanically, and allow motivation to follow. As the novelist E.L. Doctorow said about writing, it's like driving a car at night. You can see only as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. The Roman general and Stoic Cato the Younger was known for his unwavering principle. When civil war erupted between Pompey and Caesar, Cato chose the difficult, dangerous path of opposing Caesar's dictatorship rather than accepting the comfortable routine of the new regime. He knew the likely outcome, defeat and possibly death, but recognized that his identity was shaped by his choices. "I am not interested in preserving the status quo," he declared. "I want to overthrow it." Though his side lost the war, Cato's example of choosing principle over comfort inspired generations of Romans who followed. For those deeply entrenched in routine, such examples might seem remote from daily reality. Few face choices as stark as Cato's. Yet the principle remains. Each day offers moments where we can choose mechanical routine or conscious action. The accumulation of these choices, however small, determines whether we live by default or by design. The Stoics would be particularly troubled by our modern tendency to confuse busyness with purpose. Many lives that appear dynamic on the surface, filled with activity, achievement, acquisition, operate within invisible routines just as constraining as more obviously stagnant existences. The executive who works 70 hours weekly, advancing through career milestones while postponing the creative pursuits that would bring genuine fulfillment, is no less trapped than the person watching television night after night. The trappings of success can disguise a profound failure to live authentically. What makes breaking routine particularly challenging in contemporary life is the absence of natural disruption. Our ancestors faced regular upheavals, migrations, wars, natural disasters that forced adaptation. Modern conveniences buffer us from change, allowing routines to extend indefinitely without external interruption. This comfort is a mixed blessing. While it provides security, it removes the evolutionary pressure to grow through challenge. The Stoics advocated creating artificial disruptions precisely because they recognized how easy it is to settle into comfortable mediocrity. Behind the fear of breaking routine lies a deeper anxiety, the fear of confronting who we truly are and what we truly want. Routine provides not just physical comfort, but psychological insulation from difficult questions of purpose and meaning. Busyness becomes a shield against existential reflection. As Seneca observed, to be everywhere is to be nowhere. The scattered attention of a routine-filled life prevents the focused introspection necessary for authentic choice. This avoidance exacts a terrible price, one paid in the currency of potential unrealized. Psychologists speak of counterfactual thinking, the contemplation of what might have been. As we age, these unlived possibilities can become sources of regret, more painful than any failure experienced through action. Research consistently shows that people regret inaction more than action. Opportunities not taken more than mistakes made. The road not taken haunts more persistently than the difficult journey attempted. The path out of routine's labyrinth requires more than intellectual understanding. It demands a fundamental recalibration of how we relate to discomfort. The Stoics recognized what modern psychology has confirmed. Human beings are wired to avoid pain more intensely than we're programmed to seek pleasure. This evolutionary bias served our ancestors well in wilderness environments where threats were immediate and physical. In contemporary life, however, this same instinct leads us to avoid beneficial discomfort. The temporary unease of changing careers, the vulnerability of deepening relationships, the strain of learning new skills, even when these discomforts would ultimately lead to flourishing. Hierocles, a lesser-known but important Stoic, developed the concept of appropriate actions, choices that align with our nature as rational beings capable of virtue. He argued that when we repeatedly act against our nature by choosing comfort over growth, we create a discord that manifests as what we now call cognitive dissonance. This internal conflict between what we do and what we know we should do doesn't simply disappear because we ignore it. Instead, it transforms into a background radiation of dissatisfaction, a constant low-grade fever of the soul that colors everything we experience. Consider the research of psychologist Gabriele Oettingen, who found that positive fantasies about the future, imagining success without confronting obstacles, actually decrease motivation and energy. This finding would not have surprised the Stoics, who advocated a practice called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, in which they vividly imagined worst-case scenarios not to induce anxiety, but to diffuse it. By mentally rehearsing difficulties, they developed confidence in their ability to handle whatever came. The modern psychological equivalent, defensive pessimism, has been shown to reduce anxiety and improve performance in uncertain situations. This approach stands in stark contrast to contemporary self-help literature that often emphasizes positive visualization. The Stoic insight, validated by current research, is that acknowledging potential difficulties doesn't discourage action. It prepares you for it, inoculating against the shock that might otherwise derail your efforts. By naming your fears explicitly, you strip them of their paralyzing power. The Roman aristocrat Seneca, despite his immense wealth and influence, regularly practiced what we might now call exposure therapy. Beyond his voluntary hardships, he would explicitly rehearse losing everything he valued: status, wealth, even loved ones. This wasn't morbid rumination, but pragmatic preparation. Set aside a certain number of days, during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, he advised, saying to yourself the while, "Is this the condition that I feared?" Through these exercises, he discovered that the conditions he dreaded were entirely manageable, often little more than inconveniences. This practice reveals another crucial truth. Uncertainty is more unbearable than known hardship. Research in behavioral economics consistently shows that humans prefer a certain negative outcome to an uncertain one that might be better or worse. We stay in unsatisfying jobs because the alternative, unemployment, reduced income, failure in a new position, involves uncertainty. Yet this very uncertainty is what makes life vital, rather than merely survivable. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, came to philosophy only after losing everything in a shipwreck. From catastrophe emerged his greatest contribution. Before his disaster, he had been a wealthy merchant, living comfortably but without purpose. After washing ashore in Athens with nothing but his life, he discovered philosophy and founded a movement that would influence civilization for millennia. His personal catastrophe, the collapse of his routine existence, created the space for something far more valuable to emerge. Few modern examples illustrate this principle more clearly than Viktor Frankl, who, while not a Stoic, embodied Stoic resilience during his imprisonment in Nazi concentration camps. Stripped of everything external, career, manuscripts, family, possessions, even clothing, he discovered what the Stoics had long taught: that meaning can be found even in suffering, and that inner freedom persists when all external freedoms are removed. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, he wrote, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. This profound truth undercuts the most common justification for remaining in stultifying routines. I have no choice. The Stoics would counter that while circumstances may constrain options, the response to those circumstances remains yours alone. The prisoner in solitary confinement still decides how to interpret his confinement. The employee facing a toxic workplace still chooses whether to endure silently, speak up, or seek employment elsewhere. The spouse in an unfulfilling marriage still determines whether to address problems directly, seek counseling, or consider separation. Constraints exist, but rarely as absolutely as we imagine. The Japanese concept of ikigai, the intersection of what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for, offers a modern framework for the Stoic emphasis on living according to nature. Finding this sweet spot requires experimentation, failure, and readjustment, precisely the messy process that routine-bound existence avoids. Yet research indicates that those who pursue work aligned with their values report significantly higher life satisfaction, regardless of income level, than those who prioritize security or status alone. This satisfaction isn't just subjective feeling, but appears to affect physical health. Studies link meaningful activity to reduced inflammation, lower stress hormones, and even longer telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes associated with longevity. The body itself seems to recognize the difference between purposeful action and empty routine, responding differently at the cellular level. The Stoic emphasis on living according to nature thus finds unexpected validation in contemporary biomedicine. What prevents this knowledge from translating into action? Beyond fear lies another culprit: the sunk cost fallacy. After years invested in a particular career path, relationship, or lifestyle, abandoning it feels like wasting that investment, even when continuing promises diminishing returns. Economists note that rational decision-making should consider only future costs and benefits, disregarding resources already spent. Yet humans consistently make irrational choices to justify past investments. Epictetus addressed this tendency directly. Remember that you are an actor in a drama, of such a kind as the author pleases to make it. If short, of a short one; if long, of a long one. If it is his pleasure, you should act a poor man, a cripple, a governor, or a private person. See that you act it naturally. For this is your business. To act well the character assigned you, to choose it is another's. The role you've played until now need not determine the role you play tomorrow. The script remains unfinished, awaiting your revisions. This theatrical metaphor extends beyond individual choices to social expectations. Much of what keeps people in unsatisfying routines is social pressure, explicit or implicit messages about what constitutes success, appropriate timing for life transitions, or acceptable risk. The person who remains in a prestigious but soul-crushing profession often does so partly because explaining a career change to family, friends, and colleagues seems more daunting than enduring private misery. The Stoics recognized these social pressures but considered them indifferents, external factors that, while not irrelevant, should never outweigh virtue in decision-making. Musonius Rufus scandalized Rome by arguing that women should receive the same philosophical education as men, a position that challenged entrenched social norms. His willingness to endure public criticism demonstrated the Stoic principle that external approval counts for little compared to internal integrity. This courage to defy convention becomes increasingly important in a world where social media amplifies conformist pressure. Each life transition now comes with the implicit requirement to justify choices to an expanded social circle. The decision to change careers, relocate, end a relationship, or pursue an unconventional path triggers not just personal doubt, but public commentary. Navigating this terrain requires the Stoic capacity to distinguish between useful feedback and projections of others' fears. Research on decision-making reveals another obstacle to breaking routine: choice paralysis. When faced with too many options, people frequently choose none, defaulting to the status quo. A famous study found that shoppers presented with 24 jam varieties were less likely to purchase any jam than those shown only 6 varieties. The same principle applies to life choices. The sheer number of possible paths creates decision fatigue that reinforces inertia. The Stoics would tackle this problem through their emphasis on hierarchical values. Rather than weighing all options equally, they established clear priorities. Virtue, wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance came first. Everything else was subordinate. This framework simplified decision-making tremendously. Instead of asking, "What will make me happiest?" a question with countless possible answers, they asked, "What virtue does this situation require?" a question with a much narrower range of responses. Applied to modern life, this approach might mean asking not, "Which of 500 possible careers would maximize my satisfaction?" but rather, "What work would allow me to exercise wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance?" Not which of 50 cities might make me happiest, but where can I best serve others while developing my character? These questions may not eliminate complexity, but they provide a compass for navigating it. The digital revolution has introduced yet another dimension to routine-bound existence: the illusion of engagement without actual commitment. Social media allows the simulation of social connection without vulnerability. Online courses provide the appearance of learning without application. Virtual activism creates the feeling of contribution without concrete action. These technologies offer not just distraction, but plausible substitutes for the meaningful activities that would otherwise demand breaking comfortable patterns. What makes this particularly insidious is how these substitutes hijack the brain's reward circuitry. The dopamine release from receiving likes, completing easy online modules, or sharing outrage provides immediate satisfaction, while deeper needs for authentic connection, mastery, and impact remain unmet. The ancient Stoics warned against mistaking pleasure for eudaimonia, flourishing. Modern neuroscience explains why this confusion is so pervasive. Our brains evolved in environments where pleasure and flourishing were more closely aligned than they are in contemporary contexts. Breaking free requires recognizing that discomfort isn't just an unfortunate side effect of change, but an essential element of growth. Psychologists speak of optimal anxiety, a level of stress that enhances performance rather than impairing it. Too little challenge produces boredom. Too much creates panic. The sweet spot in between, where tasks are difficult but achievable, produces what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called flow, a state of complete immersion and satisfaction. The Stoics didn't use these terms, but they understood the concept. Antisthenes, an influence on early Stoic thought, declared that "I would rather be mad than experience pleasure." Not because he rejected joy, but because he recognized that profound satisfaction comes from overcoming meaningful challenges, not from avoiding discomfort. Modern research confirms this counterintuitive finding. Activities requiring effort and skill ultimately produce more satisfaction than passive consumption, even though the latter might seem more immediately appealing. Perhaps the most profound obstacle to breaking routine is what economists call hyperbolic discounting. Our tendency to disproportionately value immediate rewards over future benefits. Even when we intellectually understand that short-term discomfort would yield long-term flourishing, our decision-making consistently prioritizes immediate comfort. This isn't a character flaw, but a built-in feature of human cognition that served our ancestors well in environments of scarcity and unpredictability. The Stoics developed practices to counter this tendency, particularly the contemplation of death, memento mori. By regularly reflecting on life's brevity, they recalibrated their perception of time, making long-term consequences more emotionally salient. Research confirms that this practice shifts time perception. People who contemplate mortality make more far-sighted decisions, prioritizing legacy over immediate gratification. Applying this wisdom requires designing environments that support rather than undermine intentional choice. Behavioral economists call this choice architecture, structuring options to promote desired outcomes. When trying to break a routine-bound existence, this might mean removing digital distractions during decision periods, scheduling regular reflection time, creating public accountability for changes, or physically changing environments to disrupt habitual responses. Paradoxically, routine itself can be harnessed to break routine. By establishing regular practices that prompt reflection and intentional choice, you create what might be called meta-routines, habits that prevent unconscious habituation. The Stoics engaged in regular self-examination, often at day's end, reviewing their actions and preparing for tomorrow's challenges. This practice didn't eliminate structure, but ensured that structure served purpose rather than replacing it. Those who successfully escape routine's gravity typically describe not a single dramatic break, but a series of incremental shifts that eventually reach critical mass. The novelist changes his life not by quitting his job immediately, but by writing 500 words daily before work. The entrepreneur builds her business not by instantly abandoning security, but by devoting evenings and weekends to developing her product. The athlete transforms his body not through one heroic gym session, but through consistent training over months. What unites these examples is the recognition that waiting for perfect conditions ensures perpetual waiting. As Seneca observed, it is not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It is because we do not dare that things are difficult. The choice to begin, imperfectly, incompletely, inadequately, matters more than the specific form that beginning takes. Consider the practice of philosophers throughout history who periodically abandoned comfortable circumstances for simplicity. From Diogenes living in his barrel, to Thoreau at Walden Pond, to Gandhi spinning his own cloth. These weren't merely symbolic gestures, but practical experiments in liberation from artificial need. By temporarily relinquishing comforts, they discovered how few externals were truly necessary for well-being, thereby expanding their freedom to choose more meaningful paths. The ultimate Stoic insight about breaking routine might be this: the goal isn't to eliminate structure, but to ensure that structure reflects conscious choice rather than unconscious drift. A life without patterns would be chaotic and exhausting. The aim is not the absence of routine, but the presence of purpose. Regular patterns consciously aligned with core values, rather than unconsciously adopted from environment, convention, or path dependence. This alignment creates what psychologists call harmonious passion. Engagement that energizes rather than depletes, that feels chosen rather than compelled. Research distinguishes this from obsessive passion, which drives activity through guilt, compulsion, or external validation. The former correlates strongly with well-being and sustainability, the latter with burnout and diminished satisfaction despite apparent success. When you recognize the signs of routine-bound existence, the creeping sameness of days, the dreams deferred indefinitely, the growing gap between what you do and what you value, remember that this recognition itself represents an opportunity. Awareness precedes change. The discomfort you feel is not an indictment, but an invitation. What the Stoics might call the voice of nature, calling you back to a life aligned with reason and virtue. The journey from mechanical routine to purposeful living isn't completed in a day or even a year. It requires ongoing vigilance against the tendency to settle for comfort over meaning. Yet each step taken expands your capacity for the next step, creating an upward spiral of increasing agency. What begins as difficult becomes merely challenging, then eventually natural. The discomfort never disappears entirely, nor should it, as growth requires stretching beyond current capacities. But it transforms from enemy to ally, a signal that you're moving toward rather than away from your potential. The final Stoic truth about breaking routine might be this: freedom isn't found in the absence of constraints, but in the conscious choice of which constraints to accept. The routine-bound life accepts constraints unconsciously imposed by circumstance, convention, or fear. The purposeful life chooses constraints that align with deepest values, commitments to people and principles that matter most. These chosen constraints don't limit freedom, but express it in its highest form, the freedom to become fully what you are capable of being. Sign 5. You avoid discomfort and challenge. The human condition has always been defined by struggle, a fundamental truth woven into the very fabric of our existence from the dawn of humanity to our modern era. When our earliest ancestors huddled around flickering flames, their eyes scanning the impenetrable darkness for predators, they understood intuitively what many of us have forgotten: that life itself is an exercise in confronting challenges. From those primal days of survival against the raw elements to our contemporary battles with deadlines, digital distractions, and existential uncertainty, difficulty has been our constant, unwavering companion on the journey of human experience. Yet somewhere in the comfortable cocoon of modern convenience, a dangerous idea has taken root. The notion that the good life is synonymous with the comfortable life, that true happiness emerges from the absence of difficulty rather than its purposeful embrace. This misconception stands in stark contrast to the wisdom of the ancient Stoics, who recognized discomfort not as an enemy to be vanquished, but as a teacher to be respected. Seneca, whose insights continue to resonate across 20 centuries, articulated this principle with characteristic eloquence when he wrote, "Difficulties strengthen the mind, as labor does the body." These words carry a profound truth that transcends time and culture. Just as muscles atrophy and weaken without the resistance of physical strain, the human spirit, our resilience, creativity, and moral character, withers without the strengthening influence of challenge. The mind, like any adaptive system, requires stress to evolve beyond its current limitations. Consider for a moment the journey of the dedicated athlete who seeks progress not despite discomfort, but precisely because of it. The burning sensation that fills the lungs during a long-distance run, the deep ache that permeates muscles during the final repetitions of a challenging set. These sensations are not warning signs to retreat, but essential indicators of imminent growth. The experienced weightlifter understands intuitively that the final painful repetition, the one that requires every ounce of focus and determination, is exactly the one that stimulates the body's adaptive response. The discomfort is not incidental to the process. It is the very catalyst that makes transformation possible. This principle extends far beyond the realm of physical training to encompass every dimension of human development. When we examine our contemporary lives through this clarifying Stoic lens, a troubling pattern emerges from the comfortable haze of modern existence. We have systematically engineered a world designed to eliminate friction and difficulty at every conceivable turn, often without considering the hidden costs of this seemingly benevolent mission. Our food appears at our doorstep with a few effortless taps on a glowing screen, requiring neither the planning nor the effort that sustained our forebears. Our entertainment streams endlessly into our homes, carefully curated to our preferences, demanding nothing more from us than passive consumption. Our climate-controlled environments maintain perfect temperatures regardless of the season outside, insulating us from even the mildest discomforts of heat or cold. And perhaps most concerning of all, should we feel even the slightest emotional discomfort, boredom, sadness, uncertainty, or loneliness, we have countless digital distractions readily available to numb these sensations before they can deliver their important messages. This relentless and increasingly sophisticated pursuit of comfort and convenience has not delivered the profound happiness and contentment it so confidently promised. Instead, we find ourselves in the midst of what many sociologists and psychologists identify as a paradox of modern life. As our material comforts have multiplied exponentially, rates of anxiety, depression, and existential dissatisfaction have climbed alongside our technological capabilities. The more we insulate ourselves from discomfort, the less equipped we become to handle the inevitable challenges that life presents. Our comfort-seeking behaviors, rather than protecting us, have rendered us increasingly vulnerable to the very difficulties we seek to avoid. The ancient Stoics would view this situation not with surprise, but with knowing recognition. Marcus Aurelius, who bore the immense responsibility of ruling the Roman Empire while practicing Stoic principles in his personal life, understood with remarkable clarity that comfort breeds a particular kind of weakness that leaves us ill-prepared for reality. In his personal journals, writings never intended for publication, but which have survived as the timeless meditations, he reminded himself, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." This profound insight suggests that obstacles are not merely inconvenient barriers to be circumvented, but the very material from which a meaningful and resilient life is constructed. Our challenges, properly understood, are not distractions from our path, but the path itself. The evidence supporting this ancient wisdom surrounds us in countless forms, visible to those willing to look beyond the cultural worship of comfort and ease. Individuals who have navigated significant hardship, whether economic deprivation, health crises, or personal loss, often demonstrate remarkable psychological fortitude when facing new challenges. They've developed what contemporary psychologists now formally recognize as post-traumatic growth, a fascinating phenomenon in which adversity becomes the seedbed for enhanced meaning, deeper relationships, and greater appreciation for life. This concept, though recently named by modern psychology, was intuitively understood and actively cultivated by the Stoic philosophers. 2 millennia before brain scanning technology or double-blind studies confirmed their observations. Meanwhile, those who have been carefully sheltered from meaningful difficulty, often with the best intentions by loving parents, educational institutions, or a consumer culture selling comfort as the ultimate value, frequently find themselves psychologically unprepared for life's inevitable disappointments and challenges. We witness college students experiencing genuine psychological crises when confronted with viewpoints that contradict their existing beliefs, lacking the cognitive flexibility that develops through engagement with intellectual difficulty. We observe young professionals unraveling when their carefully curated career plans encounter unexpected obstacles, having never developed the adaptive capacity that comes from wrestling with genuine constraints. Perhaps most poignantly, we see relationships dissolving at the first appearance of conflict, rather than using that conflict as an opportunity for deeper understanding and connection. A tragic consequence of viewing discomfort as inherently problematic, rather than potentially transformative. This pattern is not merely anecdotal, but has been documented through rigorous research. Psychological studies consistently demonstrate that resilience, our capacity to recover and even thrive after setbacks, is not primarily an innate, fixed trait determined by genetics, but rather a dynamic skill developed through appropriate exposure to manageable challenges followed by adequate recovery. The critical distinction here is manageable. The Stoics never advocated needless suffering or reckless exposure to trauma, but rather the intentional embrace of challenges carefully calibrated to stretch our capacities without breaking them, a process modern psychologists call operating within the zone of proximal development. The contemporary convenience economy, with its promise of frictionless living, has inadvertently created what some sociologists have termed luxury fever, a condition in which our baseline expectations for comfort continuously rise, leaving us increasingly sensitive to even minor discomforts that previous generations would have barely noticed. This hypersensitivity represents a form of psychological fragility that leaves us poorly equipped for the inevitable challenges of human existence. Our ancestors, transported to our time, would undoubtedly marvel at our material abundance while simultaneously pitying the spiritual and psychological poverty that often accompanies it. They understood intuitively what many of us have forgotten, that meaning and fulfillment emerge primarily from productive struggle, not from passive ease. This principle becomes immediately apparent when we honestly compare the deep satisfaction we experience after completing a difficult but meaningful project with the peculiarly hollow sensation that typically follows hours of mindless scrolling through social media feeds or binge-watching content that demands nothing of us. The former activity, whether completing creative work, mastering a new skill, or solving a complex problem, may involve considerable discomfort in the form of mental strain, uncertainty, or moments of frustration. Yet it leaves in its wake a sense of genuine accomplishment and meaning that no purely passive activity, regardless of how pleasurable in the moment, can possibly match. As Epictetus, the remarkable Stoic teacher who rose from slavery to become one of antiquity's most profound moral philosophers, observed with characteristic insight, "The greater the difficulty, the more glory in surmounting it." But how do we reclaim this ancient wisdom in a contemporary world increasingly engineered to shield us from even the mildest forms of discomfort? The solution lies not in wholesale rejection of modern conveniences, a futile and unnecessary exercise in ascetic extremism, but in deliberately and strategically introducing what the Stoic philosophers called voluntary discomfort into our lives. This practice, central to Stoic psychological training, involves intentionally exposing ourselves to challenging situations that we might otherwise instinctively avoid, not as a masochistic form of self-punishment, but as a carefully designed training program for developing the psychological resilience that genuine happiness requires. In the Stoic conception, voluntary discomfort functions much like a vaccination for the soul. By introducing measured doses of challenge under controlled conditions, we develop the internal resources necessary to face life's inevitable larger difficulties with equanimity and strength. Seneca himself regularly practiced temporary poverty, deliberately living with minimal resources for short periods despite his immense wealth, not from guilt or self-abnegation, but from the practical recognition that fear of loss often creates more suffering than loss itself. By practicing discomfort, he inoculated himself against the anxiety that haunts those who have never tested their capacity to thrive under constrained circumstances. The practice of voluntary discomfort takes countless forms, each offering unique benefits for psychological development. Cold exposure, whether through brief cold showers, winter swimming, or simply venturing outdoors in challenging weather, trains our nervous system to regulate itself under stress rather than immediately seeking escape. Fasting or simplified eating teaches us to distinguish between genuine hunger and mere appetite, while revealing how many of our perceived needs are actually conditioned preferences. Physical challenges like hiking difficult terrain, engaging in demanding exercise, or learning physically complex skills develop not just the body, but the mind's capacity to persist through discomfort toward a meaningful goal. Public speaking, artistic performances, or sharing creative work publicly exposes us to the fear of judgment that prevents so many from expressing their authentic voice. Each practice, though uncomfortable in the moment, expands our comfort zone and reveals capabilities we never knew we possessed. The transformative power of voluntary discomfort extends far beyond mere resilience building. It fundamentally alters our relationship with fear itself. When we deliberately expose ourselves to challenging situations, something remarkable happens. The abstract anxieties that once loomed so large in our imagination shrink to their actual dimensions when confronted directly. The Stoics understood that most human suffering originates not from objective circumstances, but from our judgments about those circumstances, particularly our anticipatory fears about what we might not be able to handle. Epictetus captured this principle perfectly when he observed, "It is not things that disturb people, but their judgments about things." Through voluntary discomfort, we systematically dismantle these catastrophizing judgments by proving to ourselves, through lived experience rather than abstract reasoning, that we are capable of enduring far more than our comfort-seeking minds would have us believe. This psychological reframing represents one of the most liberating aspects of Stoic practice. With each intentional exposure to difficulty, whether physical, emotional, or intellectual, we expand not just our capacity for endurance, but our fundamental conception of what constitutes a genuine problem versus a mere inconvenience. The modern person who has never experienced true hunger may experience genuine distress when a food delivery arrives late. The individual who has practiced intermittent fasting understands viscerally the vast difference between minor appetite and genuine need. This recalibration of our sensitivity to discomfort doesn't make us callous to suffering, quite the opposite. It enhances our capacity for accurate empathy by helping us distinguish between trivial complaints and genuine hardship, both in ourselves and others. The historical record provides compelling evidence for this counterintuitive relationship between voluntary hardship and psychological flourishing. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the unimaginable horrors of Nazi concentration camps, observed that among his fellow prisoners, it was often those who had previously lived the most privileged and sheltered lives who collapsed most quickly under the camp's brutal conditions. Conversely, those with previous experience of hardship, particularly those who had found meaning in confronting difficulties, demonstrated astonishing resilience even amid unspeakable suffering. Frankl's observations, documented in his seminal work, Man's Search for Meaning, provide a harrowing validation of the Stoic insight that preparation for hardship through voluntary exposure is not merely philosophical theory, but practical wisdom of the highest order. This pattern repeats itself across cultural contexts and historical periods. The anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon, in his controversial but detailed studies of the Yanomami people of the Amazon rainforest, documented how tribal members deliberately subjected themselves to painful rituals and challenging survival tests, recognizing intuitively that such practices prepared them for the genuine hardships of their demanding environment. Similarly, the ancient Spartans, contemporaries of the early Stoics, built their entire educational system around the principle that controlled exposure to difficulty was essential for developing both individual character and social cohesion. While we need not embrace the sometimes extreme practices of these cultures, their independent development of similar insights across vastly different environments suggests we are observing a fundamental truth about human psychological development rather than a culturally contingent belief. The modern scientific literature increasingly confirms what these diverse traditions intuited. Research on hormesis, the biological phenomenon where exposure to low doses of stressors that would be harmful at higher doses actually produces beneficial effects, provides a physiological basis for understanding why appropriate challenges strengthen rather than weaken us. Studies on neuroplasticity demonstrate that the brain physically reconfigures itself in response to difficulty, developing new neural pathways and strengthening existing ones when confronted with appropriate challenges. The emerging field of psychoneuroimmunology reveals fascinating connections between psychological resilience and immune function, suggesting that how we mentally frame and respond to stressors may influence our physical health in profound ways the Stoics could have intuited, but never scientifically verified. Perhaps most compelling is the growing research on the psychological state known as flow, pioneered by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. This optimal experience, characterized by complete absorption in a challenging but manageable task, appears to be one of the most reliably rewarding experiences available to human consciousness. Yet flow cannot emerge from passive comfort. It requires engagement with activities that stretch our capabilities while remaining within the realm of possible mastery. In other words, the psychological state most associated with genuine happiness requires precisely the kind of voluntary challenge the Stoics advocated. The path to well-being runs directly through the territory of appropriate difficulty, not around it. Yet despite this convergent evidence from diverse fields, our modern culture continues to promote the pernicious myth that comfort and happiness are synonymous, that the ideal life is one free from challenge, effort, or discomfort. This belief manifests in countless small decisions. The parent who intervenes at the first sign of their child's frustration, denying them the essential experience of working through difficult emotions. The educational institutions that increasingly emphasize self-esteem protection over intellectual challenge. The endless parade of products promising to eliminate even the mildest forms of discomfort from our lives. Each represents a well-intentioned but fundamentally misguided attempt to create happiness by removing the very conditions that make genuine fulfillment possible. The consequences of this cultural misdirection appear in surprising places. Researchers have documented a troubling decline in grip strength across populations in developed nations, a seemingly trivial metric that correlates surprisingly well with overall physical health and longevity. This decline reflects not just changing patterns of physical labor, but a broader retreat from engagement with the material world in favor of digital environments that demand nothing from our bodies. Similarly, studies show declining ability among many young adults to tolerate ambiguity or navigate conflicting viewpoints. Cognitive skills that develop primarily through wrestling with intellectual challenges rather than consuming pre-digested information that confirms existing beliefs. These trends manifest in our emotional lives as well. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt has documented concerning patterns of emotional reasoning among younger generations. The tendency to interpret uncomfortable feelings as reliable indicators of external threat, rather than as normal responses to challenging situations that might contain valuable information or growth opportunities. This pattern creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Avoiding situations that trigger difficult emotions prevents the development of emotional regulation skills, making future emotional discomfort even more overwhelming and avoidance more likely. The result is a progressive constriction of experience that masquerades as self-care, but actually represents a profound form of self-limitation. The Stoics would recognize these patterns instantly. Seneca warned explicitly against the dangers of constant comfort in his letter to Lucilius. A man who has been through continual troubles and dangers is hardened against pain and can endure more easily even the cruelest sufferings. But one who has always spent his time in pleasures will weep and lament at the slightest pain. His observation, made nearly 2,000 years ago, anticipates with remarkable precision the findings of modern psychological research on distress tolerance and emotion regulation. The ancients understood what we are at risk of forgetting, that comfort, pursued as an end in itself, becomes a subtle but effective prison that constrains our capacity for meaningful living. The essential Stoic insight is not that comfort is inherently bad. The Stoics were not ascetics who glorified suffering for its own sake, but rather that comfort makes a terrible master, though it may be a pleasant servant. When we organize our lives primarily around the avoidance of discomfort, we unwittingly sacrifice the very experiences that give life its depth and meaning. The satisfaction of hard-won achievement, the intimacy that comes from navigating conflict in relationships, the expanded perspective that emerges from engaging with challenging ideas, the self-knowledge that develops only through testing our limits. A life optimized for comfort is ultimately a life diminished in its essential human dimensions. This insight has profound implications for how we approach personal development in the modern world. Rather than asking, how can I minimize discomfort in my life? The question implicitly posed by so much contemporary self-improvement literature, we might instead ask the more stoically aligned question, what forms of discomfort might I benefit from deliberately embracing? This reframing transforms our relationship with challenge from one of avoidance to one of strategic engagement. Like the athlete who recognizes that growth occurs at the edges of current capacity, we can learn to view appropriate discomfort not as failure of our comfort management systems, but as the essential stimulus for developing our full human potential. What might this look like in practice? The applications are as diverse as human experience itself. The professional who voluntarily takes on projects slightly beyond their current capabilities rather than remaining safely within established expertise. The parent who allows their child to struggle productively with age-appropriate challenges rather than intervening at the first sign of frustration. The couple who develops skills for navigating conflict rather than avoiding potentially difficult conversations. The citizen who engages thoughtfully with political perspectives that challenge their existing views rather than remaining within an ideologically homogeneous information environment. Each represents a form of voluntary discomfort that builds capacity rather than diminishing it. Physical practices offer particularly accessible entry points to this ancient wisdom. The cold plunge that has gained popularity in wellness circles represents a direct continuation of the Stoic practice of voluntary physical discomfort. Seneca himself advocated swimming in cold water as a form of psychological training. Similarly, various forms of intermittent fasting connect us with the Stoic tradition of periodic abstention from comfortable eating patterns, not primarily for physical benefits, though these exist, but for the psychological freedom that comes from recognizing our independence from immediate appetite satisfaction. Even the simple practice of deliberately delaying gratification, waiting before checking that notification, allowing yourself to experience boredom before reaching for distraction, saving a desired purchase for a truly special occasion, connects us with the Stoic understanding that psychological freedom comes not from indulging every desire, but from maintaining conscious choice about which to honor. The digital realm, which presents unique challenges to Stoic practice through its optimization for frictionless engagement, offers particularly important opportunities for deliberate discomfort. The decision to batch email or social media checks rather than responding to each notification creates space for sustained attention that strengthens our capacity for deep work. Periodic digital fasts, whether for hours, days, or longer periods, remind us of our capacity for independent thought and direct experience unmediated by screens. Even the simple practice of deliberately pausing before responding to triggering content online builds the essential Stoic skill of inserting reflective space between stimulus and response. What modern psychologists call metacognition, and the Stoics might have termed prososche, or mindful attention. Intellectual development similarly benefits from intentional engagement with difficulty, reading texts that stretch our comprehension rather than merely confirming existing beliefs, engaging sincerely with perspectives that challenge our ideological commitments rather than dismissing them through motivated reasoning, writing to clarify our thinking rather than merely consuming the thoughts of others. Each represents a form of voluntary intellectual discomfort that expands our cognitive capabilities rather than leaving them to atrophy in the comfortable but constraining bubble of confirmation bias and algorithmic recommendation. Perhaps most importantly, emotional resilience develops primarily through willingness to experience the full range of human feelings, rather than selectively avoiding those we label as negative. The Stoics did not advocate emotional suppression, contrary to popular misconception, but rather a clear-eyed willingness to experience emotions without being dominated by them. Epictetus advised his students not to try to avoid grief when losing something valued, but to say, "I am returning what was given to me." This attitude acknowledges emotional pain without amplifying it through resistance or catastrophizing. Modern psychological approaches like acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, have independently arrived at remarkably similar conclusions, finding that willingness to experience difficult emotions rather than attempting to control or eliminate them paradoxically reduces their power to derail meaningful living. The cumulative effect of embracing these various forms of voluntary discomfort extends far beyond specific domains of resilience. It fundamentally transforms our relationship with fear itself, perhaps the most significant contribution Stoic practice offers to contemporary life. When we systematically expose ourselves to carefully calibrated challenges across multiple dimensions of experience, we gradually dismantle what the Stoic philosopher Epictetus called the phantoms of fear that prevent so many from living with authentic freedom. We discover experientially, rather than merely intellectually, that we are capable of navigating difficulty with dignity and even grace. This lived knowledge provides an unshakable foundation for meaningful action in an uncertain world. Consider how differently we move through life when operating from this foundation of tested capability, rather than untested anxiety about what we might not be able to handle. The person who has never voluntarily faced challenged lives constantly in fear's shadow, making decisions based primarily on avoiding potential discomfort rather than pursuing genuine value. Their world progressively shrinks as they eliminate situations that might trigger difficulty, often without consciously recognizing this subtle constriction of experience. By contrast, the individual who has systematically exposed themselves to voluntary discomfort approaches uncertainty with realistic confidence based on empirical self-knowledge. They can truthfully say to themselves, "I have faced difficulty before and discovered my capacity to endure it. Whatever challenges arise, I will find a way through." This is not naive optimism, but grounded faith in tested capabilities. This distinction becomes particularly crucial during inevitable periods of genuine hardship that no amount of preparation can prevent. Job loss, relationship dissolution, health crises, bereavement. These universal human experiences arrive uninvited in every life. In such moments, the capacity to distinguish between productive and unproductive suffering becomes essential. Those who have developed this discernment through voluntary discomfort practices approach involuntary hardship not with brittle resistance or helpless collapse, but with the resilient flexibility the Stoics called apatheia, not absence of feeling as commonly misunderstood, but freedom from being dominated by destructive emotional patterns. They can honor genuine grief without drowning in it, acknowledge legitimate fear without being paralyzed by it, experience natural anger without being consumed by it. The contemporary Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, though coming from a different philosophical tradition, captured this Stoic insight perfectly when he observed, "The seed of suffering in you may be strong, but don't wait until you have no more suffering before allowing yourself to be happy." This integrative perspective acknowledges that discomfort is not something to be eliminated from human experience, but rather placed in proper relationship with meaning and purpose. The capacity to maintain this perspective emerges not from abstract philosophy alone, but from the embodied wisdom that develops through intentional practice. Particularly the practice of voluntary discomfort the Stoics so wisely advocated. As we confront the unprecedented challenges of the 21st century, climate change, technological disruption, political polarization, economic uncertainty, this ancient wisdom becomes not merely personally beneficial, but collectively essential. A culture comprised primarily of comfort-seeking individuals lacks the psychological resources to address complex problems requiring short-term sacrifice for long-term benefit. By contrast, communities that cultivate resilience through intentional challenge develop the collective capacity to face difficult truths without despair and navigate complexity without oversimplification. The Stoic practice of voluntary discomfort, far from representing a mere personal lifestyle choice, offers a foundational contribution to our shared capacity for meeting humanity's most pressing challenges with wisdom and courage. The path forward does not require abandoning modern conveniences or romanticizing needless suffering. It asks only that we recognize comfort as a means rather than an end, a pleasant support for meaningful living rather than its primary purpose. It invites us to reclaim the ancient wisdom that genuine fulfillment emerges not from the elimination of challenge, but from its purposeful embrace. It encourages us to ask not how can I avoid discomfort today, but rather what form of purposeful challenge might help me develop my fullest potential. This shift in orientation, though subtle, contains the seeds of profound transformation, both personal and collective. The Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus, Epictetus's teacher, offered this timeless guidance. We should not avoid discomforts as though they were evils, nor should we pursue pleasures as though they were the ultimate good. In this balanced perspective lies a profound template for meaningful living, neither seeking suffering for its own sake, nor fleeing it at all costs, but rather engaging purposefully with the full spectrum of human experience in service of developing our highest capabilities. This is not merely philosophical theory, but practical wisdom validated across centuries of human experience and increasingly confirmed by contemporary research. The choice before each of us is clear, though rarely framed with such clarity in our comfort-oriented culture. We can continue organizing our lives around the pursuit of comfort and the avoidance of discomfort, a path that promises ease but delivers fragility. Or we can embrace the Stoic alternative, strategic engagement with voluntary discomfort as a pathway to developing the psychological resources that genuine fulfillment requires. The former path may offer temporary pleasure, but leads ultimately to diminished capacity and shrinking horizons. The latter, though occasionally demanding, opens into expanding possibilities for meaning, purpose, and authentic happiness that transcends momentary emotional states. Seneca's insight that difficulties strengthen the mind as labor does the body offers not just ancient wisdom, but a practical invitation to a more meaningful way of living. By reclaiming the purposeful embrace of challenge as essential to human flourishing, we connect ourselves with an unbroken tradition of practical wisdom that stretches from antiquity to the present day. We discover, often to our surprise, that many of the limitations we perceived as fixed boundaries were merely the edges of our comfort zones, artificial constraints that dissolve when deliberately engaged. And perhaps most importantly, we recover the profound sense of agency that comes from recognizing that while we cannot control all external circumstances, we can systematically develop our internal resources for navigating whatever life presents with dignity, wisdom, and even joy. The decision to embrace voluntary discomfort as a path to greater psychological freedom represents not a rejection of happiness, but its deepest pursuit, grounded not in transient pleasant feelings, but in the enduring satisfaction that comes from living in alignment with our highest human capabilities. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself in his private journals, the art of living is more like wrestling than dancing, insofar as it stands ready against the accidental and the unforeseen, and is not easily thrown. Through purposeful engagement with challenge, we develop this essential art, learning not merely to survive difficulty, but to transform it into the very material from which a meaningful life is crafted. Changing direction before it's too late. In the end, recognition without action is merely a form of intellectual entertainment. We can nod along to these 5 warning signs, understanding them conceptually, perhaps even seeing them reflected in our own experiences, but what truly matters is what we do next. The ancient Stoics weren't interested in philosophy as an academic exercise. They viewed it as a practical discipline, a way of living that demanded implementation. Those who came before us, Marcus Aurelius writing by candlelight in military camps, Seneca navigating the treacherous politics of Nero's court, Epictetus teaching despite having been born into slavery, they didn't merely contemplate these principles, they lived them, often in circumstances far more challenging than our own. When we recognize the signs that we're living the wrong life, we stand at the threshold of transformation. This moment of awareness is precious, but also precarious. How many times have you had a flash of insight about your life, felt the certainty of needed change in your bones, only to have that clarity slowly fade as the days pass and routine reclaims you. The Stoics would call this a tragedy, to see the truth and then look away. What would have become of Hercules, Seneca asked, if there had been no lion, hydra, stag, or boar, and no savage criminals to rid the world of? What would he have done in the absence of such challenges? Obviously, he would have just rolled over in bed and gone back to sleep. So by snoring his life away in luxury and pleasure, he never would have developed into the mighty Hercules. Our challenges, including the discomfort of recognizing we've taken a wrong turn in life, are not obstacles to our flourishing, they are the very means of it. The resistance we feel toward change is the precise weight we must lift to build strength of character. The first sign, perpetually postponing happiness, speaks to our habit of conditional living. I'll be happy when. But happiness deferred is happiness denied. The present moment is all we ever truly possess. If you caught yourself in this pattern, recognize that this revelation isn't a judgment. It's an invitation to reclaim your life from the tyranny of someday. The second sign, measuring your life against others, reveals how we surrender our authority to external standards. When we compare ourselves to others, we forget that we're living our life, not theirs. Your journey has unique terrain, challenges, and purpose that can never be meaningfully measured against another's path. The third sign, the misalignment between your stated values and your actual behaviors, points to the internal dissonance that drains our vital energy. This gap doesn't make you a hypocrite, it makes you human. But acknowledging this disparity is the first step toward integrity. That state of wholeness where your outer actions reflect your inner convictions. The fourth sign, the constant feeling that time is slipping through your fingers, reflects not a shortage of time, but a misallocation of attention. Time anxiety is often a symptom of living at odds with your deeper priorities, of saying yes to demands that don't serve your true purpose. And the fifth sign, that hollow feeling after achieving what you thought would fulfill you, teaches us perhaps the most profound lesson of all, that meaning comes not from reaching destinations, but from choosing the right journey. If any of these signs struck a chord within you, consider this moment a gift. Many people live entire lives without ever awakening to these realizations. They drift from one year to the next, guided by inertia rather than intention, until they find themselves asking where the time went and why fulfillment feels so elusive. But you are not them. You are here now, aware, and awareness creates choice. The core of Stoic philosophy rests on a crucial distinction. There are things within our control and things beyond it. Our opinions, impulses, desires, aversions, these things are up to us. But our body, property, reputation, status, and all things not of our own doing, these are not up to us. This distinction isn't merely philosophical, it's practical, liberating, and potentially life-changing. When we invest our identity and happiness in externals we cannot control, we become hostages to fortune. But when we focus on what we can control, our judgments, actions, and character, we reclaim our power regardless of circumstances. The Stoics weren't denying the reality of hardship or suggesting that external conditions don't matter. They were offering something far more valuable, a framework for finding freedom and dignity within any circumstance. Marcus Aurelius didn't write his meditations from a peaceful retreat, but while leading armies against hostile forces on the frontiers of the Roman Empire. Epictetus developed his philosophy having experienced the trauma of enslavement. These were not privileged philosophers theorizing from ivory towers. They were individuals facing life's harshest realities who discovered that true freedom begins with our internal response. If you've recognized these signs in your own life, the message is clear. The time to change is now. Not tomorrow, not when conditions are perfect, not when you have more certainty or resources, now. This urgency isn't about pressure, it's about possibility. Seneca, in his treatise On the Shortness of Life, observed, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it." This isn't meant to induce guilt, but to awaken us to the preciousness of our days. We treat time as though it were infinite, postponing our most authentic life for a future that is never guaranteed. We delay difficult conversations, put off pursuing meaningful work, rationalize staying in situations that diminish rather than enhance our spirits. But life is happening now, in this imperfect moment, with all its complexity and uncertainty. The Stoics would argue that waiting for perfect conditions before making a change is like waiting for the sea to be still before setting sail, an endless delay. Consider for a moment what your life would look like if you began aligning it more authentically with your deepest values. Imagine the relief of no longer feeling that subtle but persistent sense of living out of alignment. Picture the energy that would be liberated if you weren't constantly swimming against the current of your own nature. Envision the dignity that comes from living deliberately rather than by default. This isn't about dramatic external changes, though those might eventually come. It's about the internal shift that happens when you begin making choices from a place of self-awareness rather than unconscious conditioning. It's about the quiet revolution that occurs when you start asking, "Is this true to who I am?" rather than, "Is this what's expected of me?" And it begins with small steps, not grand gestures. Perhaps it's setting a boundary where you previously would have compromised yourself. Maybe it's dedicating time to something that brings you alive but has been crowded out by obligations. It could be having the courage to acknowledge that a path you've invested years in no longer serves who you're becoming. The changes themselves matter less than the consciousness you bring to them. This is what the Stoics meant by living in accordance with nature. Not some abstract ideal, but the honest expression of your deepest truth. As we conclude, remember that philosophy is not meant to be admired from a distance, but lived up close in the messy reality of everyday choices. The Stoics weren't interested in creating scholars of their ideas, but practitioners. People who embodied wisdom rather than merely discussing it. So what kind of life will you choose? Will you continue along the path of least resistance, allowing habit and expectation to shape your days? Or will you accept the invitation these 5 signs have offered, to live with greater intentionality, to align your actions with your values, to focus on what truly matters rather than what merely clamors for attention? The choice, as the Stoics would remind us, is ours alone to make, and in that choice lies our dignity, our freedom, and ultimately our fulfillment. As Epictetus said, make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. Your power begins with awareness, continues with choice, and manifests through consistent action. The signs have shown you where change is needed. The philosophy has given you a framework for approaching that change. What remains is the most important part, the doing. And that begins now. The journey of transformation begins with a single, deliberate step. The ancient Stoics understood that philosophical revelation without practical application was hollow, mere intellectual posturing. They were, above all else, pragmatists who believed in the power of incremental change. Don't explain your philosophy, Epictetus advised, embody it. This embodiment isn't about perfection, it's about progress. The Stoic sage, their ideal of the perfectly virtuous person, wasn't held up as an achievable standard, but as a navigational star. Even Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome and one of history's most dedicated Stoic practitioners, wrote repeatedly about his own failings and continual need for improvement. In his meditations, essentially private notes to himself, he often begins days with reminders of his own shortcomings. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, "The people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly." This wasn't pessimism, but preparation, a recognition that transformation doesn't happen overnight, but through repeated encounters with our own limitations. So how do we begin this process of realignment? The Stoics left us with practical exercises that remain remarkably relevant today. First is the practice of premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Far from being a morbid fixation on what might go wrong, this practice involves calmly considering potential obstacles before they arise. If you've recognized that you're on the wrong path, anticipate the resistance you'll face in changing direction. What habits will pull you back to familiar territory? What relationships might be challenged by your new course? What internal narratives will try to convince you that change is too difficult or unnecessary? By rehearsing these challenges in advance, you remove their power to surprise and derail you. As Seneca wrote, "The man who has anticipated the coming of troubles takes away their power when they arrive." This isn't about pessimism, but preparedness, strengthening your resolve before it's tested. Another powerful Stoic practice is the evening examination, a daily review of your actions against your intentions. Seneca described his own practice. When the light has been removed and my wife has fallen silent, aware of this habit that's now mine, I examine my entire day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by. This honest self-assessment isn't meant to induce shame, but to create awareness and opportunity for adjustment. Try asking yourself each evening, what steps did I take today toward living more authentically? Where did I fall back into old patterns? What can I do differently tomorrow? This simple practice creates a feedback loop that accelerates growth and prevents the unconscious drift back toward the life you're trying to leave behind. Perhaps most importantly, the Stoics emphasized the power of attention, what modern psychologists might call mindfulness. Wherever a person can live, Marcus Aurelius wrote, there one can also live well. This isn't blind optimism, but a recognition that our experience is shaped not just by circumstances, but by what we choose to focus on within those circumstances. If you've identified that you're living the wrong life, you might be tempted to fixate on everything that's been wrong, fueling regret and self-criticism. The Stoic approach would be to acknowledge these realities without being consumed by them, then deliberately shift your attention to what can be changed in this moment and the next. This attention to the present isn't about ignoring the future. The Stoics were strong advocates for planning and forethought, but about recognizing that all meaningful change happens only in the now. You can't change your life yesterday or tomorrow. You can only change it today, in the small choices that eventually compound into a new direction. The most challenging aspect of changing course is often the fear of letting go, of identities, relationships, achievements, or securities that have defined us, even if they've also constrained us. The Stoics had much to say about this attachment to externals. Epictetus advised his students to practice saying of beloved things and people, "You are not mine, but nature's." This wasn't callousness, but clear-sightedness, a recognition that clinging creates suffering. If you've built a life around external markers of success that don't bring you fulfillment, releasing your grip on these identities requires courage. If you've surrounded yourself with relationships that reinforce your old patterns, creating distance may feel like betrayal, both of others and of your former self. The Stoics would counsel neither rash abandonment nor fearful clinging, but thoughtful discernment. What serves your growth toward virtue? What diminishes it? Musonius Rufus, the teacher of Epictetus and a respected Stoic in his own right, emphasized that philosophy shouldn't be merely theoretical, but should manifest in the most practical aspects of daily life, from how we eat to how we dress, to how we arrange our living spaces. This attention to the mundane wasn't trivial, but transformative. If you're changing the direction of your life, look to these daily habits and environments. Do they reflect and support who you're becoming, or do they keep you tethered to who you've been? The power of environmental design wasn't lost on the ancient Stoics. Seneca, despite his immense wealth, practiced periods of voluntary poverty to remind himself that he could thrive with less, and to inoculate himself against the fear of loss. You might not need such extreme measures, but consider, how could you arrange your physical spaces and daily rituals to support your realignment? What reminders could you place in your environment to keep your new direction visible when the pull of old habits strengthens? A critical distinction in Stoic philosophy is between impression and assent, between what appears to be true and our judgment about it. When we feel stuck in the wrong life, we often mistake our impressions. "I can't change, it's too late, this is just how things are," for objective reality. The Stoics taught the practice of questioning these impressions before giving them our assent. Epictetus instructed, "Make it your practice to say to every harsh appearance, 'You are just an appearance, and not at all what you appear to be.'" This pause, this questioning of what seems self-evident, creates the space for new possibilities to emerge. The next time you feel the weight of impossibility around changing your life's direction, remember this distinction. Ask yourself, is this limitation real, or is it an impression I've habitually accepted as true? The community around you will play a crucial role in your transformation. Seneca wrote extensively about the importance of choosing our associates carefully. The company of those unlike ourselves corrupts us of necessity. The more people there are, the greater the danger. This isn't elitism but practicality, recognition that we absorb the attitudes and values of those we spend time with. As you change direction, consider who exemplifies the qualities you wish to develop, who challenges you toward greater authenticity rather than greater conformity, who respects your growth even when it creates distance. These are the relationships to nurture. For those connections that consistently pull you back toward your old patterns, the Stoic approach is not necessarily severance, but mindful engagement. Being in the world, but not of it, as the saying goes. One of the most subtle yet powerful Stoic practices is the view from above, mentally stepping back to see your life and challenges from a cosmic perspective. Marcus Aurelius practiced this regularly. You can rid yourself of many useless things among those that disturb you by comprehending the scale of the world, by contemplating the eternity of time, and observing the rapid change of every single thing. This perspective shift doesn't diminish the importance of your choices, but places them in a context that can reduce their associated anxiety. When changing the direction of your life feels overwhelming, try this practice. Imagine viewing your situation from increasingly distant perspectives, from outside your home, your city, your country, your planet, your galaxy. From this vantage point, see the brevity of a human life, the universality of struggle and growth, the countless others who have faced similar crossroads. Then return to the present moment with both a sense of humility about your concerns and renewed conviction about making the most of your brief time. The Stoics were not ascetics who denied the body to elevate the mind. They understood that physical well-being supports philosophical practice. Musonius Rufus taught that the philosopher's body also must be well prepared for work, because often virtues use it as a necessary tool for the activities of life. As you reorient your life, consider how your physical habits, sleep, nutrition, movement, rest, either support or undermine your capacity for sustained change. The mind and body aren't separate entities, but aspects of a unified whole, each influencing the other. Perhaps the most challenging Stoic teaching for modern ears is their emphasis on accepting what we cannot change. In an age of seemingly limitless possibility and relentless self-improvement messaging, the idea of acceptance can seem like defeat. But the Stoics weren't advocating passive resignation. They were pointing to the freedom that comes from clearly discerning what is and isn't within our control. Epictetus stated this principle with characteristic directness. Some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, office, and in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. This distinction isn't meant to limit your ambition, but to focus it effectively. If you're changing the direction of your life, pour your energy into what you can actually influence, your judgments, your choices, your responses, rather than exhausting yourself against immovable externals. Accept the constraints of reality not as barriers, but as the very conditions within which meaningful choice becomes possible. The philosopher Nassim Nicholas Taleb, a modern thinker heavily influenced by Stoicism, calls this amor fati, the love of fate. Not a passive acceptance of whatever happens, but an active embrace of reality as the necessary starting point for any meaningful action. When you find yourself living the wrong life, begin not with fantasy about how things should be different, but with clear acceptance of where you actually are. This groundedness isn't resignation, but the foundation for effective change. As you move forward, remember that transformation isn't linear. There will be setbacks, periods of confusion, days when old patterns reassert themselves with surprising force. The Stoics didn't expect perfection, even from themselves. "I am not yet a wise man," Seneca wrote, "nor shall I ever be." What they practiced instead was constancy of purpose, returning again and again to their principles, regardless of how many times they strayed. This constancy isn't about rigidity, but about resilience, the capacity to begin again without self-condemnation. If you find yourself slipping back into the life you're trying to leave behind, the Stoic response isn't shame, but renewed attention. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, If you've made a mistake or done something wrong, get back up and carry on, just as if nothing had happened. The path of transformation is not about arriving at some perfect state, but about the quality of attention you bring to each step along the way. It's about creating alignment between your deepest values and your daily choices, not as a destination, but as an ongoing practice. The reward isn't some distant achievement, but the immediate experience of living with greater integrity and purpose, even in the midst of challenge. One of the most powerful Stoic insights is that virtue, living according to nature and reason, is sufficient for happiness. This doesn't mean that external goods like health, wealth, and reputation have no value, but that they aren't necessary for a good life. The implications of this view are profound. If you've been chasing externals at the expense of your character, you've been looking for fulfillment in things that can never provide it. This shift in focus from external acquisition to internal cultivation doesn't happen overnight. It requires consistent practice, community support, and regular return to foundational principles. But it offers something external pursuits never can: a sense of fulfillment that doesn't depend on circumstances beyond your control. As you realign your life with your deeper values, you may find that external changes naturally follow. Relationships transform or end, career paths shift, priorities rearrange themselves. Let these changes emerge organically from your clearer understanding rather than forcing them from a place of reaction or impulse. The Stoics valued deliberation and thoughtful action over hasty decisions, even in matters of significant change. Remember too that your transformation doesn't occur in isolation. Every shift in your own life creates ripples that affect others. Anticipate resistance, misunderstanding, even opposition from those who have grown accustomed to you as you were. This isn't necessarily malice, but the natural human response to change. Approach these reactions with compassion rather than defensiveness, recognizing that your growth may trigger discomfort in others that has little to do with you. At the same time, your realignment may inspire others who have felt similarly constrained, but lacked the language or courage to change direction. Without proselytizing or judgment, your example of living more authentically can create permission for others to examine their own lives more honestly. This is legacy at its most meaningful, not what you leave behind when you're gone, but the possibilities you open for others through how you live. The Stoics believed in the brotherhood of humanity, the idea that we are all citizens of the same world, endowed with the same capacity for reason. This cosmopolitan vision extended beyond national or cultural boundaries to embrace all of humanity. As you reorient your life, consider: how does your path contribute to this larger human community? How might your particular gifts and insights serve not just your own fulfillment, but the common good? This isn't about grandiose visions of changing the world, but about the everyday opportunities to embody wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation in your interactions with others. It's about recognizing that personal transformation isn't separate from social responsibility, but integral to it. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "What brings no benefit to the hive brings none to the bee." In conclusion, the 5 signs we've explored aren't just warnings that you've taken a wrong turn. They're invitations to a more aligned existence. They're wake-up calls that can jolt you from the slumber of an unexamined life into the full alertness of conscious choice. They're not judgments, but opportunities, chances to reclaim authorship of your own story before its final chapters are written. There comes a moment in every genuine philosophical journey when abstract principles must crystallize into decisive action. The ancient Stoics recognized this inflection point as the true test of wisdom, the transition from knowing to doing, from contemplation to commitment. Hierocles, a Stoic philosopher whose writings have largely been lost to history, developed the concept of appropriation, or oikeiosis, the process by which we expand our circle of concern from self to family to community to all of humanity. This expansion doesn't happen through intellectual agreement alone, but through deliberate practice. Each day presents countless opportunities to transcend our narrow self-interest and align with a broader vision of human flourishing. When you notice the signs that you're living the wrong life, this expansion often feels impossible. How can you care for others when your own path feels so uncertain? Yet paradoxically, it's often through extending ourselves beyond our personal concerns that we find clarity about our own direction. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, taught in the Painted Porch, the Stoa Poikile in Athens, welcoming students from diverse backgrounds. His vision wasn't of philosophy as an exclusive pursuit for the educated elite, but as a practical discipline accessible to anyone willing to apply its principles. This democratic spirit reminds us that realignment isn't reserved for those with special advantages or circumstances. It's available to anyone with the courage to question their current course and the persistence to forge a new one. One of the least discussed but most profound aspects of Stoic philosophy is its emphasis on providence, the belief that the universe operates according to rational principles that ultimately serve the good. While many modern readers may not share the cosmic optimism of the ancient Stoics, their perspective offers a powerful reframe. What if the very signs that you're on the wrong path aren't random misfortunes but necessary redirections? What if the discomfort you feel isn't meaningless suffering but purposeful guidance? Chrysippus, one of the most prolific Stoic writers, though most of his estimated 705 works have been lost, used the metaphor of a cylinder on a slope to illustrate the relationship between fate and free will. The cylinder's shape causes it to roll when pushed. This is its nature, just as certain events in life are inevitable given their causes. But how the cylinder rolls, smoothly or erratically, depends on its internal properties, representing our response to circumstances. When you realize you've been rolling in the wrong direction, your freedom lies not in denying the slope, but in altering your internal constitution to respond differently to the same forces. The practical implications of this view are profound. Rather than seeing the signs of misalignment as indictments of your past choices, you might view them as necessary elements in your development. Not obstacles, but stepping stones. As Marcus Aurelius counseled himself, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Consider the experience of Publius Rutilius Rufus, a Roman Stoic who was unjustly exiled for refusing to participate in corruption. Rather than becoming bitter about his fate, he used his exile to study and write, eventually becoming a model of virtue celebrated by later generations. His apparent misfortune became the very condition for his most meaningful contributions. How might the current limitations or challenges in your own life contain similar hidden opportunities? This reframing isn't about toxic positivity or denying genuine hardship. It's about cultivating what modern psychologists might call tragic optimism, the ability to remain hopeful and find meaning even in difficult circumstances. The Stoics weren't naive about suffering. They simply refused to grant it the final word on human possibility. Diogenes of Babylon, another influential Stoic whose works survive only in fragments, emphasized the importance of education in developing virtuous character. But for the Stoics, education wasn't merely formal instruction, but a lifelong process of self-cultivation. When you notice you're on the wrong path, you've entered the most intensive educational program possible, one that teaches not abstract theories, but practical wisdom through direct experience. Every discomfort becomes a lesson, every mistake a curriculum, every moment of clarity a graduation. This educational frame transforms the anxiety of being wrong into the excitement of learning something essential. You're not failing at life, you're gathering the precise data you need to make more aligned choices moving forward. The Roman statesman Cato the Younger was so committed to Stoic principles that he walked barefoot and bareheaded in all weather to accustom himself to discomfort, wore simple clothing when elaborate dress was expected of his station, and ultimately chose death over compromise when faced with Julius Caesar's dictatorship. While his extreme measures may not be appropriate models for modern practitioners, his commitment reminds us that realignment often requires moving against the current of conventional expectations. If you've been living according to external metrics of success, realigning with your deeper values may appear to others as downward mobility or strange prioritization. The Stoics would counsel neither defensive explanation nor smug superiority, but quiet commitment to your path, allowing the results to speak for themselves over time. Gaius Musonius Rufus, sometimes called the Roman Socrates, taught that philosophy should be embodied in every aspect of life, from how we eat to how we dress, to how we arrange our households. This integration of philosophy into daily living stands in stark contrast to the compartmentalization many of us practice, thinking deeply in some domains while operating on autopilot in others. True realignment isn't a discrete project, but a comprehensive reorientation that touches every dimension of existence. Look to the areas of your life you've excluded from examination: habitual routines, long-standing relationships, unquestioned preferences. What wisdom might be waiting in these overlooked territories? What alignment might be possible if you brought conscious attention to these autopilot zones? One of the most misunderstood aspects of Stoicism is its approach to emotions. Far from advocating emotional suppression, the Stoics distinguished between unhealthy passions, pathos, based on false judgments about good and evil, and healthy emotions, eupatheiai, arising from accurate assessments of value. The goal wasn't emotional flatness, but emotional clarity, feelings that reflect reality rather than distorting it. When you're living out of alignment, emotions often become either tyrants or strangers, either controlling your choices through unchecked reactivity or so disconnected from your awareness that you feel numb and disoriented. The Stoic approach offers a middle path, neither suppression nor indulgence, but mindful engagement with your emotional experience. Try approaching difficult emotions with curious investigation rather than immediate reaction. What judgment underlies this feeling? Is that judgment aligned with your values? What would this emotion look like if it were based on an accurate assessment of what matters most? This practice doesn't eliminate emotional intensity, but channels it toward what truly deserves your care and concern. Panatius of Rhodes, who introduced Stoicism to Rome, modified earlier Stoic thought to be more practically applicable to the lives of Roman citizens engaged in public and political life. His adaptations remind us that philosophy isn't a static set of doctrines, but a living tradition that evolves to meet the needs of each generation and circumstance. Your own realignment needn't adhere to anyone else's blueprint, not even the ancient Stoics. The question isn't, am I Stoic enough? But is this approach helping me live more virtuously, with greater clarity and purpose? This flexible fidelity to principles rather than dogma creates space for personalized application. Perhaps certain Stoic practices resonate deeply while others feel foreign or inaccessible. This isn't failure, but discernment, the very wisdom the philosophy aims to cultivate. Trust your experience while remaining open to challenging your assumptions, a balance the Stoics themselves would likely approve. Posidonius of Apamea, a polymath who contributed to Stoic psychology, emphasized the role of early development and environment in shaping character. While the Stoics maintained that virtue can be cultivated at any age, they weren't naive about the power of early conditioning. If you've recognized you're on the wrong path, you may be struggling against patterns established long before you had conscious choice in the matter. This recognition isn't cause for deterministic despair, but for compassionate understanding of your own history. The paths we walk as adults often follow tracks laid down in childhood, by family dynamics, cultural messages, early traumas, or triumphs. Seeing these influences clearly doesn't excuse responsibility for current choices, but contextualizes the challenge of changing direction. When you find yourself reverting to old patterns despite your best intentions, try approaching yourself with the same philosophical perspective you would offer a friend. What formative experiences might be at play? What unexamined beliefs from earlier life might still be operating beneath awareness? This archaeological self-knowledge isn't about placing blame, but about bringing light to the unconscious forces that may be keeping you stuck. The Stoic emphasis on cosmopolitanism, being citizens of the world rather than merely of our local communities, has profound implications for addressing misalignment. Often we live the wrong life because we've accepted too narrow a definition of who we are and what possibilities are available to us. Hierocles visualized this as concentric circles of concern, with the self at the center, then family, then friends, then city, then country, and finally all humanity. The philosophical task, he taught, was to draw these outer circles inward, treating those more distant from us with the same care we naturally extend to ourselves and our closest relations. This expansive identity creates new possibilities for meaningful living. If you felt constrained by limited roles or opportunities in your immediate environment, consider how widening your circle of concern and contribution might open unexpected paths. What capacities within you might find expression in serving needs beyond your local context? What perspective might you gain from engaging with communities or causes that transcend your familiar boundaries? Aristo of Chios, an early Stoic who took a more radical approach than his contemporaries, argued that everything except virtue and vice was essentially indifferent, that external goods like health, wealth, and reputation held no intrinsic value. While later Stoics modified this extreme position, his perspective offers a bracing thought experiment. What if everything you've been pursuing outside of moral excellence doesn't actually matter? What if all the status markers and achievements you've strained toward are ultimately neutral with respect to your happiness and fulfillment? This thought experiment isn't meant to trivialize your efforts or induce nihilism, but to create space for re-evaluation. What if you released yourself from pursuing what doesn't truly matter to you? What if you granted yourself permission to care deeply about what does? This radical reprioritization often feels like both loss and liberation, a simultaneous emptying and filling that creates room for more aligned choices. Cleanthes, who succeeded Zeno as head of the Stoic school, was known for his religious devotion and composed the Hymn to Zeus, one of the few complete Stoic texts to survive antiquity. His integration of philosophical principles with spiritual practice reminds us that realignment often involves reconnecting with the transcendent dimensions of existence, however we might understand or experience them. For many people, living the wrong life includes spiritual disconnection, a sense of having lost touch with something larger than themselves, whether conceived in religious, naturalistic, or humanistic terms. Realigning with your deeper values may include rekindling or reimagining your relationship with these transcendent concerns. What practices help you feel connected to something beyond your individual existence? What values or principles seem to transcend personal preference and point toward universal goods? How might these connections inform your changing direction? Antipater of Tarsus, another Stoic scholar, developed the concept of selection, eklog, to explain how we should approach preferred indifference, those things that have value but aren't necessary for virtue. His framework suggests that while we shouldn't depend on externals for our happiness, we can still make reasonable selections among them based on their natural advantages. This middle way between attachment and indifference provides practical guidance for realignment. You needn't renounce all material comforts, relationships, or achievements to live more authentically. You simply need to hold them in proper perspective, valuing them appropriately without making them the foundation of your worth or happiness. As you change direction, consider what external goods serve your core values and which distract from them. What possessions, positions, or pursuits are worth selecting and which might be better released. This discernment isn't about ascetic self-denial, but about strategic simplification, creating space for what matters by releasing what doesn't. Athenodorus Canaanites, a Stoic philosopher who tutored Augustus, the first Roman emperor, advised his powerful student to recite the alphabet before acting on anger to create space for reason to reassert itself. This simple practice acknowledges the difficulty of maintaining philosophical perspective in moments of strong emotion, a challenge anyone attempting significant life changes will face. When the discomfort of changing direction triggers reactive emotions, fear, doubt, resentment, shame, having concrete practices to interrupt automatic responses becomes essential. What's your equivalent of reciting the alphabet? Perhaps it's a physical gesture, a breath practice, a phrase or question that creates space between stimulus and response. These pattern interruptions aren't about suppressing authentic feelings, but about ensuring that your reactions align with your deeper intentions rather than temporary distress. Cornutus, a Stoic philosopher and grammarian who taught the poet Perseus, emphasized the interpretation of mythology as containing hidden philosophical truths. This allegorical approach reminds us that wisdom often comes in narrative form, that stories can communicate what abstract principles alone cannot. As you navigate changing direction, pay attention to the narratives that have shaped your understanding of what constitutes a good or successful life. What stories, from family history, cultural mythology, or personal experience, have you internalized about what paths are possible or preferable? What counter-narratives might support your realignment? Sometimes the most powerful intervention isn't changing your beliefs directly, but adopting new stories that make different choices seem natural and fitting. The heroes and exemplars we carry in our imagination shape our sense of what's possible far more than intellectual arguments alone. Arrius Didymus, court philosopher to Augustus and compiler of Stoic teachings, emphasized the role of appropriate actions, kathakonta, in developing virtue. Unlike perfect actions, which only the sage could perform, appropriate actions were accessible to everyone making progress toward wisdom. This distinction creates space for growth without perfectionism, for taking imperfect steps in the right direction rather than waiting for flawless execution. As you change course, celebrate appropriate actions, choices that move you toward greater alignment even if they fall short of ideal. Perhaps you haven't completely transformed your relationship with work, but you established a boundary around weekend emails. Maybe you haven't fully aligned your consumption with your environmental values, but you made one sustainable swap in your daily routine. These incremental shifts aren't compromises but stepping stones, the very path of progress the Stoics recognized as available to all sincere practitioners. Epictetus, a Stoic senator who maintained his integrity under Nero's corrupt reign until it cost him his life, demonstrates that realignment sometimes requires standing against the prevailing currents of one's time and place. While few of us face circumstances as dramatic as Nero's Rome, we all navigate social environments that may subtly or overtly pressure us to compromise our values for acceptance or advancement. The courage to change direction often includes the willingness to disappoint others, to prioritize inner alignment over external approval. This isn't about cultivating unnecessary conflict or superiority, but about recognizing that meaningful change sometimes creates relational friction. How can you honor your connections with others while remaining true to your evolving understanding of what matters most? How might you communicate your changing priorities with compassion while maintaining appropriate boundaries? Rubellius Plautus, a Roman nobleman and Stoic who was exiled and eventually executed because Nero perceived him as a threat, used his exile as an opportunity for philosophical study and practice. His example highlights that constraints can become containers for deeper growth. That limitation often sparks creativity and clarity, unavailable in conditions of unlimited choice. If your realignment feels constrained by circumstance, financial necessities, family obligations, health limitations, consider how these very constraints might focus your attention on what's most essential. What wisdom is available precisely because of these limitations rather than despite them? What creativity might emerge from working within boundaries rather than fantasizing about their absence? Euphrates of Tyre, a Stoic philosopher praised by Pliny the Younger for combining philosophical depth with approachable manners, reminds us that changing direction needn't involve becoming severe or unapproachable. The stereotype of the dour, judgmental philosopher misrepresents the Stoic ideal, which included engaging fully in human society while maintaining inner freedom. As you realign with deeper values, you may worry about becoming disconnected from those who haven't made similar shifts. But authentic transformation often makes us more rather than less accessible, more present, more compassionate, more genuinely interested in others, rather than preoccupied with our own concerns. True philosophy doesn't isolate but connects, not through superficial agreeableness, but through deeper engagement with shared humanity. Demetrius the Cynic, though not strictly a Stoic, was admired by Seneca for his practical wisdom and modest lifestyle, despite opportunities for wealth and status. His example shows that realignment sometimes involves voluntary simplification, choosing enough over more to create space for what truly matters. In a culture obsessed with optimization and achievement, one of the most countercultural choices is deliberate limitation, saying no to opportunities that, while potentially beneficial in conventional terms, would distract from deeper priorities. This isn't about romanticizing lack, but about strategically creating margins that allow for presence, reflection, and alignment with core values. What might you strategically limit to create space for what matters most? What good opportunities might you decline to protect great possibilities? These boundary decisions aren't about withdrawal, but about focused engagement, about creating the conditions for depth rather than perpetuating breadth without meaning. See Musonius Rufus, distinct from the better-known Gaius Musonius Rufus, emphasized that philosophical training should be as rigorous for the soul as athletic training is for the body. Just as athletes subject themselves to deliberate discomfort for the sake of future performance, philosophical practitioners seek out challenges that strengthen their capacity for virtue. This athletic metaphor offers a productive reframe for the difficulties of changing direction. The resistance you feel, the discomfort of new choices, the awkwardness of unfamiliar patterns, the social friction of altered priorities isn't an indication that something's wrong, but that something's working. You're strengthening capacities that have atrophied through disuse or never been developed at all. The strain is part of the training. What if you approached your realignment as an Olympic athlete approaches their preparation, with dedication but also patience, with intensity but also strategic recovery, with focus on process rather than immediate results? This frame transforms struggle from obstacle to pathway, from problem to practice. Basilides of Scythopolis, Stoic teacher to Marcus Aurelius, appears in the Meditations as an example of gentleness combined with unwavering adherence to principle. His influence reminds us that changing direction involves both firmness and flexibility. Steadfast commitment to core values alongside adaptability in their expression. This balance is particularly important when we encounter resistance, whether internal or external. Rigidity in the face of legitimate feedback can prevent necessary course corrections, while excessive flexibility in response to discomfort can sabotage meaningful change. The Stoic ideal isn't brittle adherence to predetermined plans, but resilient commitment to underlying principles, expressed through whatever means best serve the present circumstance. As you navigate changing direction, regularly check both aspects of this balance. Are you maintaining fidelity to your deeper values, the why behind your realignment? Are you remaining flexible about the how, willing to adapt your approaches based on what you're learning through experience? This balanced commitment creates sustainable change rather than temporary reactivity. Apollonius of Chalcedon, another teacher of Marcus Aurelius, was known for his straightforwardness and moral integrity. The emperor credited him with teaching by example the importance of clarity, both in thought and expression. This clarity becomes especially crucial when changing direction, as confusion and ambiguity often become justifications for reverting to familiar patterns. Practice articulating your realignment in clear, specific terms, not just what you're moving away from, but what you're moving toward and why it matters. This clarity isn't about rigid planning, but about creating a compass that can orient you when the path becomes foggy or the terrain unfamiliar. What are the non-negotiable values guiding your new direction? What tangible expressions of these values would signal that you're on the right track? What specific practices support your continued alignment? This clarity serves not only your own navigation, but also your communication with others who may be affected by or curious about your changing course. Without clear articulation, others are left to interpret your shifts through their own assumptions, often leading to unnecessary misunderstanding or resistance. Junius Rusticus, who introduced Marcus Aurelius to the writings of Epictetus, represents the crucial role of mentorship in philosophical development. While self-study is valuable, the Stoics recognize that certain insights and corrections are only available through relationship with those further along the path of wisdom. As you change direction, consider: who embodies aspects of the alignment you're seeking? Who holds wisdom you need not through abstract knowledge, but lived experience? These mentors needn't be formal teachers or even aware of their influence. They might be friends, colleagues, historical figures, or characters from literature whose examples illuminate possibilities you might otherwise miss. The humility to learn from others doesn't diminish your autonomy, but enhances it, providing perspectives that challenge blind spots and expand your sense of what's possible. The Stoics valued self-sufficiency, but never confused it with isolation. They recognized that wisdom develops in community through the friction and inspiration of diverse viewpoints, united by common pursuit of virtue. Quintus Junius Arulenus Rusticus, nephew of Junius Rusticus and fellow Stoic, was executed under Domitian for publishing a eulogy of Thrasea Paetus, demonstrating the potential costs of philosophical integrity in hostile environments. While most of us don't face such extreme consequences for our principles, his example reminds us that meaningful realignment sometimes requires courage in the face of opposition. This courage isn't about dramatic confrontation, but about quiet persistence when changing direction would be easier to abandon. It's about continuing to make aligned choices even when they're misunderstood, criticized, or made difficult by circumstances. It's about recognizing that the internal freedom gained through living according to your deepest values is worth whatever external limitations may result. Epictetus, a freedman and Stoic who served as Nero's secretary, provides a complex example of navigating alignment within constrained circumstances. His position required engagement with a corrupt system, yet historical accounts suggest he maintained philosophical principles within these limitations. His example speaks to the challenges many face when realigning within existing structures rather than abandoning them entirely. Most of us can't simply walk away from all our current commitments to start fresh. We have responsibilities, relationships, and practical constraints that require continued engagement with systems that may not align perfectly with our values. The question becomes not whether to participate, but how. With what awareness, what boundaries, what strategic focus on influencing what can be changed while accepting what cannot. This pragmatic engagement isn't moral compromise, but mature discernment. It's about maximizing your positive impact within real-world constraints, rather than maintaining theoretical purity at the cost of practical effect. It's about recognizing that alignment isn't all or nothing, but a continual process of bringing your choices into greater harmony with your values across all domains of life. As we conclude this exploration of Stoic wisdom for changing direction, remember that philosophy for the Stoics wasn't primarily about knowledge, but about transformation. About becoming the kind of person who embodies wisdom rather than merely discussing it. The test of whether you've truly understood these principles isn't whether you can explain them eloquently, but whether they change how you live. The signs that you're living the wrong life aren't condemnations, but invitations. Opportunities to realign with what matters most before, as Seneca warned, you find yourself at the end having never truly begun. The past cannot be changed, but this present moment, the only moment in which choice is possible, remains yours to shape. The Stoics believed in providence, that the universe unfolds according to rational principles that ultimately serve the good. Whether or not you share this cosmic optimism, their perspective offers a powerful practice to approach each circumstance, even apparent misfortune, as containing the opportunity for meaningful response. Perhaps the very recognition that you've been on the wrong path isn't a cruel revelation, but a gift, the precise wake-up call needed for a more aligned life. What will you do with this awareness? How will you respond to the invitation these signs represent? The choice, as the Stoics repeatedly emphasized, is yours alone to make. And in that choice lies your dignity, your freedom, and ultimately your fulfillment. Not as distant possibilities, but as present realities made manifest through each aligned action. The time for change is now, not because the future is guaranteed, but precisely because it isn't. Not because you know exactly where the new path leads, but because you've recognized the current one leads somewhere you don't want to go. Not because realignment is easy, but because it's necessary for the life you truly want to live. Begin where you are. Start with what you can change today. Trust that each aligned step creates momentum for the next. And remember that you're not alone in this journey. Across time and space, countless others have faced similar crossroads and found their way toward greater wisdom, purpose, and peace. Their examples light the path before you, not as standards for comparison, but as confirmation that meaningful change is possible for anyone with the courage to begin. The choice is yours. What will you do with this one wild and precious life that remains to you? How will you use the time that is still yours to shape? What legacy of wisdom, virtue, and meaningful contribution will you create through your remaining days? The opportunity stands before you now, in this moment. The invitation has been extended. The door to a more aligned existence stands open. Will you step through?